when you saw the end of my Steven Universe Change Your Mind versus Steven Universe Futures finale video, well, you're gonna be seeing a compilation of 5 episodes being reviewed. I wasn't making this up. Ever since I've been watching this show and watching bits and watching every single episode of it, I really had this mindset onto doing a compilation or an anthology on reviewing episodes that are catered to one plot. Last time I did this was the Shaolin Showdown Ramundo 3-part episode where he turns into the healing side. But for this time, this is just part 1 of many parts of me talking about Steven and Connie. And believe me, it's gonna take almost a year for me to actually finish this up because there's so much other videos I need to put my focus on. So I'm just gonna say right now, do not expect me to instantly make videos like this anytime soon. I mean, I am gonna try to take my time with these videos, but at the same time, you're probably gonna have to wait a long time before I completely finish everything involving Steven and Connie shipping, basically. Yeah. Connverse, or whatever you want to prefer. So anyway, let's go start off with the anthology with Bubble Buddies. Steven is about to go on his bike while the gems are trying to find the Orange Spodgemy, which is a corrupted gem caused by you-know-who. And while Steven is about to go on his bike, he then encounters Connie, who's just reading her book by the ocean. And when Steven completely fell on the ground because his bike wasn't balanced, he gets caught by Connie, which causes him to run away. Yeah, it's just one of those make those impressions in front of the girl that you really like, but you end up making a really awkward impression or an embarrassment impression. So Steven heads back to his beach house while the crystal gems actually saw everything of what he's been doing. And this leads to a few humorous jokes or a gag involving mainly Pearl and Amethyst making fun of Steven. Well, not really making fun, but actually enjoying the fact that Steven is actually with a female, while Garnet completely just shoves in and stops Pearl and Amethyst, completely messing with Steven's funky flow, which is the quotes that Steven and she spoke in this episode. So, Steven decides to completely do another impression again by completely taking a glow bracelet that was actually from Connie, which is going to show in a flashback, but I'm going to get to that later. But just before he's about to make another impression, a boulder was about to fall on Connie, so Steven protects him by using his powers. And one of his first powers from the first season is a giant bubble that he and Connie is completely stuck in. And since that they're having interactions with each other, they need to find a way in order to have the bubble burst. And to be quite honest, that's really all I have to say involving the episode's plot. When I first watched this episode, when I was binge watching the whole series, I cannot believe how excellent this episode is when it comes to the impressions that Steven and Connie made for each other. Believe me, wherever you completely see an episode involving a male character fall in love with a female character or vice versa, you should usually expect that the character is mostly shy and just wants to actually make a proper impression, but at the same time he either makes an awkward or an embarrassing impression. But since that we're actually into 3 minutes into this episode where we actually get to see Connie and Steven actually talking to each other even though that they're trapped in a bubble, it makes this episode give the show a lot more originality and also a good relationship between Steven and Connie. Now, for everyone who's been watching the show or hasn't, should probably understand that the earlier episodes is where we need to actually get some character development from Steven and Connie. I mean, people may debate that the first season is mostly slice of life, although later seasons are more serious with character arcs growing, similar to Adventure Time in the earlier seasons. But at the same time, I really think that they really know how to handle relationships earlier in the series and building it up until we get to the later seasons. Believe me, this episode really shows to me that they actually knew what they were doing before they get into one of the most serious stuffs like the diamonds and stuff like that. Episodes that tries to build up relationships like this can easily make one of the major highlights that isn't part of the main plot involving Steven and the Crystal Gems fighting off the diamonds or corrupted creatures. And considering that this is one of the earlier seasons, you should really expect Season 1 Steven much, since that he isn't smart and he's mostly over the top. Well, it makes sense that he's a child, but considering that the little that we know about him by the time this episode aired back in December of 2013, it's really odd to actually see Steven in this position like he was in the final episodes or final seasons of the series in general. So what I'm talking about is that Steven is mostly oblivious of the fact that Lars is mocking him, saying that he's in love with Connie, and the fact that Sadie is just trying to be respectful towards Steven while completely going against Lars for making fun of Steven. But that's just something that they usually do when it comes to Lars and Sadie's relationship in the earlier seasons. Getting back to the main plot, Steven and Connie go to the pier and the theme park in order to have other ways in order to get out of the bubble. They talk to Onion in order to get the bubble destroyed, and Steven's other idea is to go on roller coaster tracks and have the bubble completely destroyed. But all it did, it just launches him and Connie off into the ocean. Yeah, into the ocean. That really goes to show that the bubble is completely indestructible, and the more details you see like this, you can really tell that the powers from the gems are really impressive, not to mention indestructible from any impact. And when they get into the bottom of the ocean with no way out, Connie officially snaps, but not like snap like she did in season 5, which I'm gonna get to probably a year later or so, is what we actually get to see on the fact that she never made any friends because she is always invisible to anywhere that she goes. The dialogue that she spoke in this episode really shows that she became a really likable character just by the first episodes of this show. And when you completely see her completely breaking down in tears without getting what she wants by making a single friend, really goes to show that her life just isn't really the best. But at the same time, when she completely understands more about Steven, her life isn't even come close to what Steven's life is like. And remember the glow bracelet that I mentioned about Steven grabbing it from the freezer? Well, he finally gives it to Connie. And he completely said that she dropped it during the parade last year, and he wanted to give it to her while also keeping it in the freezer so that it can stay glowing for a little longer. This scene is pretty much one of the most important scenes to start off a relationship for several reasons. For one, like I mentioned about the impressions that Steven is just trying to make in front of Connie but ends up making an awkward embarrassment, he actually did an impression really good in this scene. Granted, it took about a few minutes in this episode for him to do that, but at the same time he managed to do it. Secondly, compared to where we see Connie in the later seasons where she mostly gets character development, well, minus season 5, you can really tell that she really isn't the type of people who can be in a crowd while enjoying something while having friends, because like she said, she didn't have any friends whatsoever. So actually seeing that Steven actually wanted to give the bracelet back to Connie really shows the development between Steven and Connie. So I actually found this scene a lot more better. And third and lastly, after they completely express themselves about just trying to do the right thing while Connie is still enjoying it, the bubble disintegrates as they rushed up to the surface, and they see the orange spoduments from before about to attack Steven and Connie, which actually gave Steven an idea, because the glow bracelet is actually what attracts the orange spoduments. Steven uses the bracelet to lure the Spider-Man to one of the pillows so that it can destroy and have it completely stuck with no way to escape. But that also means that Steven and Connie are out of trouble before getting completely eaten. Seriously, those 3 reasons I expressed really shows that you can actually see how well the pacing is in the earlier episodes and seasons from the show. And when we see the 2 characters reconcile, well, they kind of did that once before the bubble was destroyed. You can really tell that the other characters really actually see what is actually going on. But that's just basically what happens. Well, you have Guardians, and the Guardians mostly adore what's going on, and it's mostly misunderstanding. And then we get the scene, well, Garnet just completely pulls Amethyst and Paul away. And considering that this is the first episode involving Connverse, there's gonna be pretty much a lot exploring involving Connie and Steven's relationship. And yes, I am aware that in the earlier seasons, it's not in a romantic relationship. It's mostly a friend zone relationship, but not a complete friend zone relationship. But in the later seasons, they will obviously make this as a romantic relationship. But I'm gonna get to that once I get to that. Even though that the other episodes I'm gonna get to in the future will probably show romantic feelings from Steven to Connie, even though that doesn't end up happening in front of Connie. So that's my review of Bubble Buddies, and I gotta say, it was a really good introduction. For the first episode to introduce Connie, especially one of the earlier episodes of the show, they really did what they could. I don't have any issues with this episode, but like I said, I'm mostly into the earlier episodes than the later episodes in the other cartoon. Granted, I don't keep up, but once I get to the later episodes, I will still do a good critique of them, so you're gonna have to wait until I get to them. So anyway, I give this episode an 8 out of 10, and let's get into the next episode, Lion 2, The Motion Picture. Correction, it's actually called Lion 2 the movie, but at the same time, the motion picture and the movie is basically the same thing, but whatever. Even though that this episode is mostly a Lion episode, it is still the second time we actually get to see Connie since in the first season of this show. So I can really tell that for this episode, compared to what I saw in the later series, it really goes to show that these types of episodes really shows how important Connie is even in the earlier seasons. The episode begins with Connie showing Steven a trailer of Dogcopter 3, which is her favorite film of the franchise. So this episode is mainly that this universe's world movies is popular and the other character wants the main character to watch the movie with her or him. And to be quite honest, I actually found this plot really interesting, especially that they need to get to the theater, which is far away from Steven's beach house. In order to get to the theater much more faster, Steven introduces Connie to Lion, which she's instantly shocked on seeing a lion. And since that this is the second time we get to see Lion, I am going to be discussing Lion's character in this, since that I'm probably not going to talk about the first Lion episode. Not saying I'm having anything against it, it's just that I'm focusing on the shipping between Steven and Connie, so don't expect me to actually talk about most of the characters in episodes like these, but I am gonna try my best. However, instead of heading to the theater immediately, they get teleported into an empty temple, which set up the future episode involving Paul and Steven. As for in this episode, it's revealed that it actually has weapons like swords that can appear once Steven, who is a crystal gem, places his hand on it, and in order to have it activate, Steven has to be ticklish or something in order to have this device or something to work. And to be quite honest, considering that this is the episode where we actually get to see a sword and Connie in this, I can honestly tell that they actually had plans way ahead of time than I thought. Seriously, in the second season, which I'll get to in the future, we get to see Connie practicing on becoming a sword fighter. But then when we see this episode, which was before the second season, I can really tell that the writers of Steven Universe really knew how to handle the earlier seasons when it comes to character arcs. To me, it really shows that Connie can just be more than just a bookworm, not an insult, but basically being something else instead of just reading a book. The more I look at these characters, the more I can understand that cartoon characters shouldn't be one thing. And since this is the second episode that Connie makes an appearance, you can really tell that they're gonna do a lot of development involving her and relationship with Steven. And then when Steven accidentally summons a robot that can instantly destroy him and Connie, that is where I can actually see that they're trying to have the relationship with more depth in the later seasons. Because when you completely see a robot about to attack Steven and Connie, you may think that if this is the first time you watch this episode, you know that there was something that Connie might be able to do that Steven is unable to do. Because we all know that Steven may be a crystal gem, he is still not a sword fighter. And even if this episode takes place before Connie becomes a sword fighter, we still get to see some foreshadowing when it comes to Connie's development as the series goes on. And when Connie told Steven that you shouldn't watch the movie with me because you have more important things going on, you can really tell that the development between Steven and Connie is slowly improving with each episode that they're part on. Believe me when I say this, is that when you're completely in a situation where your friend is going through some serious situations involving magical stuff or just really stressful times way worse than yours, even if your parents are strict, you can really tell that his life is a lot more important than watching the movie in theaters. But at the same time, Steven just refuses because he just wants to be Connie's friend. And since that these two characters are slowly getting to know each other, it's really obvious that the earlier episodes from this show is going to show the cliche episode plots, like having two parents or guardians meet each other, which I'm going to get to later, and the hobbies that Steven isn't accustomed to, or vice versa with Connie. So I can really tell that this episode really did what it could in order to be a really interesting step when it comes to Steven and Connie's relationship, because it's really obvious that the different hobbies that you're into, the other person or your friend will not be into one of the hobbies that you're into. So it actually kind of makes sense onto why Connie and Steven had this conversation once they head back to Beach City. But to me, that really makes me appreciate this relationship a lot more than I did before. As for Lioness, considering that he's one of those characters who doesn't speak, but then again he's an animal, and the fact that he is a really different type of creature compared to other creatures that we've seen, it's really understandable that his motivations is just to show Steven the things that he hasn't seen before, especially that the crystal gems didn't show him the empty temple and the podium of weapons and armors. I can really tell that Lion really did a really interesting impression in this episode compared to the last episode. As for later episodes, it's mostly debatable, because what Lion does in this scene, well, compared to what he does in the third episode, which, my correction, that episode is better than this, is, well, he gives Connie and Steven Rose Quartz's sword. Yeah. I can honestly believe that rewatching this episode again for preparation of this part 1 anthology review, I can really tell that this episode really knew what it was doing way ahead of time to set up the later events in the later seasons. They used the sword to stop the robot from destroying them, and geez, even though when Connie only used Steven for help by completely using the sword against the robot, it is still really good foreshadowing. Seriously, the last time I watched this episode, well, actually the first time, is well, I thought that Connie was using a different kind of sword. I didn't actually think that this was the exact same sword that she used in the later seasons until it was destroyed in the reunion episode, or reunited episode. Seriously, that's just how much I actually love the attention of detail in episodes like this, where they set up everything in the later episodes, all because of these few minutes of character development. And the episode ends with Steven, Connie, and Lion watching Darkcopter 3 on the big screen, with an MGM parody with Lion being the lion in the parody itself. I was originally not going to review this episode as part of this Anthology series because of how long it's going to take for me to talk about every single episode. But the more I think about it, I can really tell that details like these, especially on how it foreshadows in late episodes, really goes to show that the filler episodes involving Connie is basically the highlight of the filler episodes. Now, for me personally, the filler episodes in this show in general are instantly a mixed bag. I mean, I can understand that people are instantly complaining on the fact that it's skipping the major plot and it's extending it way too long while having most of the focus on the Steven filler episodes. But for episodes like this, when it comes to Connie's arc, I can really tell that they honestly knew what to do with Connie in order to have a really interesting development when it comes to foreshadowing. If you haven't watched this show before and you're actually binge watching this from the first episode to the final episode, which includes Steven Universe's future, I can instantly tell you that you're probably going to be seeing a lot of details when it comes to the relationship involving Steven and Connie. Especially when we get to see Connie and Steven use Walls' sword, which is also a foreshadowing to Connie using Walls' sword in the second season. I really think that this episode did slightly better over the last episode, considering that there was so much of it that I completely missed out when it comes to my first viewing. And watching this for a second time and doing a little bit more research on it, I can really tell you that this episode is way better, not really way better, but better than Bubble Buddies, which is why I'm giving this episode an 8.25 out of 10. And the sad thing is, we're not even halfway there. Seriously. There's only 3 more episodes to talk about in this video alone, and I'm already just getting started with this Connverse Anthology. Anyway, the next episode I'm going to be reviewing for this part is an Indirect Kiss, which isn't really much of a Connverse episode. It's mainly Steven and the Crystal Gems trying to fix something before Amethyst dies, but at the same time, since this actually leads to more development involving the relationship, it's really fair to talk about this episode as part of the Anthology. This episode begins with Steven telling the story to Connie about what's been happening to him today. In the first scene of his story, we saw Amethyst goofing around until she falls off a cliff, which is causing her to lose part of herself because of the fact that she's a crystal gem, and considering that crystal gems are different than humans, she's about to use her body parts by completely stretching them out very badly while also speaking in reverse. The only option to have Amethyst be back to the way she was is to go to a fountain where Rose's tears can cure the situation that Amethyst is at right now. And I gotta say, considering that this is Rose we're talking about, who is aka Pink Diamond, you can really tell that they really want to actually have the cure be a lot more serious while also completely having a heartwarming moment between Steven and her mother. But since I just said that Rose was Pink Diamond all along, it's honestly hard to look at this episode the same way you did back in 2014. For me personally, I honestly think that this episode really knew how to handle Steven's situation as a crystal gem compared to what Connie does in her life with strict parents. Believe me when I say this, is that when Stevens is trying to be honest with Connie while talking out his problems, you can really tell that Connie, who was in the first episode before she met Steven, was invisible without making any friends whatsoever. So I honestly think that if you were ever in this situation, you will probably be like Connie if she actually see the things that Steven has went through, while also just trying to have an open mind when it comes to being a close friend towards Steven. Getting back to the main plot of this episode, it's a typical Steven and the Crystal Gems going on an adventure and trying to stop a corrupted gem or a different type of plot. And I gotta say that this episode involving Amethyst trying to be saved by having to go to a fountain that can heal up everything, I can honestly tell that Steven really wanted to do everything he can in order to stop Amethyst from dying. And since that was part of his trauma in the future series, it really goes to show that a lot of this stuff is really serious. Now, some may debate that Steven is mostly joy in the earlier seasons, but at the same time, when you get older, the more you realize that your past is gonna haunt you, and the more you learn from your mistakes. Granted, Steven didn't do anything wrong in this episode since the Amethyst fell off a cliff, but when it comes to his trauma, it's still gonna be stuck into his mind. And since this is the first time I'm ever talking about Paul and Garnet when it comes to them being the major plot in these episodes, granted, I did talk about Change Your Mind and Steven Universe Future, but considering that there were side characters and there were tools for Steven to work with, I'm just gonna say right now that their presence in this episode is pretty much the highlight of this episode. Not because of how helpful they are to Steven, but the fact that they're just trying to take the situation seriously while also just trying to save Amethyst from getting killed. And since that they're trying to figure out a way in order to have the Fountain of Roses Tears to go on, is literally a task that has to happen, otherwise they won't be able to succeed their task. Granted, they don't do much in this, considering that Amethyst is the only character who's dealing with a midlife crisis, well, mainly because it was mostly her fault that she fell off the ledge. It still makes you really relate to Paul and Garnet on just trying to help on the situation, since that they're way more powerful gems than Steven. But considering that they're the reasons why the fountain was working properly and it wasn't Steven all along, you can really tell onto why Steven would feel extremely depressed that it wasn't entirely him that saved Amethyst's life. But at the same time, this is a work in progress when it comes to Steven, especially that this was before Mio Gem. As for Steven in this episode, the reason why he's extremely depressed is because he actually thought he saved Amethyst's life, but since I mentioned that it was actually Paul and Garnet, he's really depressed that he isn't used for the help that Amethyst, Garnet, and Paul they go on adventures, and the fact that he's mostly useless to them. Give this episode some credit. This is one of the earlier episodes from season 1. Okay, granted this episode is 24, but at the same time, season 1 is the longest season out of any other season from the show. So they really did what they could in order to actually give Steven some kind of a purpose. Granted, the Steven-only perspective got worse as the series goes on, but I'm gonna get to that in a different video in the future. His scenes involving Amethyst is pretty much one of the highlights of this episode, for mainly the fact that he's dealing with a situation while Paul and Garnet tries to figure out a different solution in order to have the fountain go working. And since that Amethyst doesn't have the ability to move and kept using her body while also speaking in reverse, no kidding, there's actually a video where we get to see the dialogue from Amethyst in reverse, which is just a normal dialogue. The way that Steven is dealing with this kind of stress, especially the fact that Amethyst is this close of dying, really shows that he wants to be better, just like Amethyst, Paul, and Garnet. But little did he know that it was actually them that completely saved the fountain. It really goes to show that he's really upset that he won't be able to have some kind of purpose with the crystal gems. Which takes us back to the reason onto why this is our Connverse episode, just like the last one. Well, I mentioned that because I was planning on skipping this episode, but then again, I didn't have much plans in the earlier days of me thinking up with these ideas, so don't judge me. The reason why the scenes between Connie and Steven are important is because, like I mentioned, is that Steven is dealing with a depression that he wasn't really important, and the fact that his powers are mostly useless. But Connie said to Steven that you don't need magical powers by being with her. that really goes to show that Connie is actually respectful towards Steven, since this is the 3rd episode, and the fact that she listened to everything that what Steven told about his story with the crystal gems today. If this episode never happened, I can guarantee you that the relationship between Connie and Steven won't improve whatsoever, considering that we're just gonna get more cliche episodes when it comes to love letters and parents meeting the guardians of Steven. And in my opinion, if this episode was an episode that was just gonna be like every other episode, then this episode will probably have the cliche format of a character talking to another character or what they did today, and the end of the episode, nothing emotional happens whatsoever, which is one of those episodes that does happen in the real world, won't be memorable, it would just be forgettable at most. And considering that these episodes involve Steven and the Crystal Gems just trying to fight a corrupted monster or doing other things, expect the emotions to come up in these episodes, because no matter what, they will still come. Granted, not all of them, but at the same time, it really makes the character relationships improve as the series goes on. After Connie took a drink from Steven's juice box, she's about to kiss him by the screenshot alone, but she then stopped because she had a headache, but then she realized her eyesight vision is changed. She no longer needs lens in order to see through the glasses. She can actually see everything just like Steven does without any glasses. Apparently, it was because of Steven's spit that actually healed the vision from Connie. So apparently Steven does have some kind of a purpose with his powers. It was his spit that can actually heal anything, not just his tears. Well, when it comes to Leo episodes involving him fixing Lars and Jasper, it's a really debatable whether you are on board if that's okay or not. But for here, when it comes to his spit, it really goes to show that they really did a good job on having Steven be half human while also being half crystal gem. That is something that I actually enjoy from Steven's character in this show the most. This episode was centering around the depression of Steven and him telling his story to Connie. And then when he actually learned that some of his powers actually healed Connie's eyesight, really makes this episode a truly better episode than the last one. And yes, I know that this is the second time I've stated that since I finished my perspective on Lion 2 the movie, but do you really see how good this relationship that they're doing? And this is the 3rd episode that I'm discussing right now, and there's still pretty much 10 or more left to discuss in the later years. Well, not really later years, but in the later months whenever I get back to this shipping Anthology. Seriously, this is one of those examples onto how Steven Universe could have been a great cartoon, but due to the decision making, it just didn't happen, which I am afraid I'm going to be talking about that once I get to season 5 when it comes to this relationship. But that's going to take up a lot, but that's going to probably happen either next year or something else along the line at the end of this year, depending on what I do. But just looking at this season, it's really depressing that whether you say how far they come when it comes to the relationship, you cannot deny that the earlier episodes, mainly from this one, are better than the ones in the later seasons. Sure, I'll discuss what I have when it comes to the episodes involving seasons 2 through 5, but compared to those episodes to this, I honestly think that they really knew how to start somewhere. But as for the middle part, despite the fact that the Connie episodes are still filler episodes, they could have at least tried to actually make us sympathize with Connie, because I'm just gonna move on because I'm not going to say the 2 words that you're probably familiar with. All in all, this episode deserves a 9 out of 10. So far, this is the best episode I've seen involving the Connverse Anthology, but since there's 2 more episodes to discuss, let's get into fusing Cuisine. Okay, I'm just gonna get this out of the way. This is the weakest episode of this anthology. Yeah, I'm being extremely happy, but then seconds later, I'm mostly depressed with a frown on my face. Well, what do you actually expect? This is an anthology, so you need to expect that episodes are in order. I have to review or have to be in order so I can actually talk about them in the chronological order. You need to understand that. If you were in my seat right now, you would do the same. So anyway, this episode is mainly about, like I mentioned in the episodes that I talked about, Steven, the Crystal Gems, or his guardians, meet with Connie's parents. And that's basically it. Now, before you ask, yes, this is another filler episode, just like every other Connie episode. However, the difference is that the structure of this episode is mostly on the cliche format, which I can forgive to, but the ending is honestly more confusing and it's more rushed. That can really make this episode mostly dated, even for an episode that, if you're not into the Steven and Connie relationship. I did mention that Connie's parents are really strict no matter what they look at, the things that Connie's into. And considering that they're not welcome to actually see 3 crystal gems, or basically Steven's mothers, acting completely different and not accustomed to eating, really goes to show the situation that Steven is dealing with. I mean, he can take his father since that he's actually human, but for the crystal gems, it's gonna be a really tricky task to actually impress Connie's parents. Now, for the most part, even if this cliche has done multiple times, I'm still tolerable with it. For a show that involves different types of creatures, and I do it for crystal gems, dealing with the crisis in order to help Steven stay in a relationship with Connie by talking to Connie's parents on being respectful parents like they are, is an interesting idea. They try to make it cool, but at the same time, Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl came up with a strategy by fusing together into a giant mother in order to impress Connie's parents. And the fusion that they formed together is Alex Strangite, who is... This is the first episode where we get to see her make her first appearance, and to be quite honest, to give this episode credit, they actually made a good introductory by having Alex Strangite have her first appearance while trying to help Steven to stay in a relationship with Connie. But other than that, other than the joke of Garnet on the phone about children playing swords, which is Connie and Steven, and then they're bleeding and they're dead, and she said good day or something, this episode itself isn't really much of an impact. One of the issues I have with this episode is that this is the same episode that Beach Party did when it comes to the Crystal Gems hanging out with the citizens on Beach City. Even if you can debate that those characters are different from Connie's parents, it's still the same plot. And for how this plot is like, even if Pearl, Amethyst, and Garnet are fusing together to help Steven, it is still the same thing. Granted, it is a different change when it comes to Amethyst, Garnet, and Pearl not having issues with Connie's parents, but at the same time, Connie's parents are still strict no matter what, and they would instantly criticize anything if they don't like it. I would give this episode the benefit of the doubt, even if it is a cliched episode, but at the same time, watching Beach Party and this episode, even if there are still changes, it's still the same thing that the citizens of Beach City, even if Connie and her parents don't live in Beach City, aren't getting into the idea that Steven's parents are 3 crystal gems. Because at the same time, they're still human even if they're not living in Beach City. Anyway, I should probably talk about Connie's parents since that this is the first time we get to see her. I get that they're strict and I can understand that they're trying to do right for Connie, but at the same time, in a later episode in Season 2 that I'm going to talk about in the future, it really goes to show that this is just basically a starting point when it comes to Connie's parents. And considering that Steven is just trying to do a good impression of Connie's parents, which are way different people than Connie when it comes to the personalities, it is mostly difficult for Stephen to actually have her guardians eat food, which Paul despises foods. Like, she cannot stand eating food, which what makes her different compared to humans on Earth. And as for the other characters, mainly Garnet, and Amethyst, they're mostly plot devices. I say this because, considering that Amethyst actually likes eating food while Garnet doesn't really eat food but have the same opinions as Paul, I can guarantee you that they really didn't know what to do with the crystal gems in this other than the final minutes of this episode, but I'm gonna get to that soon. This episode itself is honestly way more predictable, and even if it's a cliche I can easily respect, it still isn't enough to make this episode good in my view. And when we get the scene of Connie's mother scolding her daughter for lying, and the fact that she's preventing her to go to be with Steven, Connie just runs away, and they don't flinch whatsoever when they see the one and only daughter running away in depression. And this leads to the issue I have with this episode. Before we get to the ending of this, we just see Connie's parents just not having any emotion of Connie just running away. In fact, it feels like they're accustomed to seeing Connie just running away on the stress that she's dealing with on just trying to have a happy life. And before any of you asks, yes, there is build-up when it comes to Connie's mother in the Season 2 episode, but the thing is, since that we had this episode and we didn't know what was going to happen next in the later episodes, it really makes this episode really hard to actually take the ending seriously. Now let's go talk about the ending, because quite frankly, damages this episode's credibility. After the dinner became a disaster because of what happened, Connie is mostly apologetic to Steven while Steven is apologetic to Connie. And the fact that Connie had this ideal by just completely running away so that she doesn't have strict parents is really pushing it. I mean, seriously. I get that Connie's young and stuff like that, but considering that she's 12 years old and she's gaining more education when she gets older, shouldn't she be aware that running away shouldn't be solving any problems like this? The best thing I can actually think of is to have a conversation with Connie's parents about how they shouldn't be this protective towards Connie and actually understand what she likes and what she does not. I can understand Steven doing something like this since that he never went to school or do anything like what Connie does, but considering that this just leads to a really confusing ending, really makes this episode really difficult for me to actually enjoy. So just before they ran away, Garnet, Amethyst, and Paul completely fused again as Alexandrite to stop Steven and Connie from leaving. And because Steven completely ran away with Connie, the Crystal Gems grounded Steven from watching any television for over 1,000 years. You know, I would consider this humorous the first time I saw this, but the more I think about it, the more how I see how over-exaggerating this is when it comes to the Crystal Gems not understanding how the Earth works, since that Steven is still part human. And this somehow impressed Connie's parents because the Crystal Gems are also strict like them. That's just how rushed this ending is, because we don't get to see a word from Steven or Connie about any of this, and they just had to take them by the guardians' words in order to actually have this relationship continuing on in some other way. This, in my opinion, is one of those examples on how not to rush an ending, despite the fact that this is a cliched episode involving two parents with two childs meeting each other and not being on board with the same stuff because of how different they are. It just feels like they're forcing Amethyst, Paul, and Garnet to do something in this episode, since that they're mainly plot devices for Steven to work with in order to stay in a relationship with Connie. But for how it's executed, it really makes the ending really rushed, and it honestly makes me depressed that Steven is grounded for 1,000 years from television. Seriously, I get that running away isn't a good thing, and it's something that parents can easily go against too, but seriously, 1,000 years? That is something that if Steven destroys something very important to poor Garnet or Amethyst, I can really understand, but 1,000 years? It just really shows that the Crystal Gems just aren't fully accustomed to any of the stuff of what humans do on Earth. The resolution at the end of this episode doesn't even really fit the mood, even if it's mainly two guardians of children just completely agreeing with each other, just the fact that they did something that what a mother or parent can do, which does make it realistic, but at the same time, it doesn't excuse that this was a rushed resolution to this episode. So yeah, I did not like this episode that much. I mean, sure, it had a great joke involving Garnet, the introduction of Alexandrite, but other than those, this episode really didn't do much. Granted, it kind of continued the relationship with Connie and Steven, but at the same time, it was a rushed resolution that mostly damaged it. So I give this episode a 5.5 out of 10. But there's only one more episode to culminate this video, and that episode is Alone Together. Now, this is an episode to wrap up part 1 of this anthology, and I gotta say, I was planning on not reviewing this episode as part of this first part of this anthology, but at the same time, I really think that me reviewing most of these episodes way more so I don't have to do a lot of waiting when it comes to reviewing the later episodes is honestly the better decision. I'm really relentless on making these reviews. This is like the 5th episode I'm talking about in this recording time of me reviewing the 4 episodes. I'm that relentless. The episode starts with the Crystal Gems teaching Steven how to fusion dancing. And since that we're seeing these characters dance in order to become a fusion in the earlier episodes from this show, it's really understandable that Steven should understand how to fuse into other characters. But it also shows that the fact that the fusion that we're seeing between Steven and Garnet and Steven and Paul together, which only happened at the final episode of Steven Universe, from the original that is, it really makes you think that what would have happened if we actually see these fusions in the earlier episodes before I change your mind. Steven won't be able to fuse with the other Crystal Gems because it's way too difficult to synchronize the moves in order to make the fusion happen. And considering that this is an episode where he meets with Connie in order to dance on the beach, it really goes to show that a lot of possibilities can happen in this show. And since that this is an episode that really got into the relationship shipping between Steven and Connie, expect the unexpected if you're new to this show, that is. Connie told Steven that she never danced whatsoever, and the fact that Steven is dealing with a stressful time in order to fuse with the other Crystal Gems, he thinks that she should dance with Connie in order to start somewhere, and I have to admit, it's difficult to actually fuse with someone while having the same movements in choreography with the dancing. And considering that he wants to start with Connie in order to do the dancing, even if it may be an off way in order to start off with fusion dancing, it is still a way to start somewhere in order to improve over the mistakes that Steven did in the beginning of this episode. When Connie agrees to dance with Steven, they completely have fun by dancing by the beach with the music from Steven's phone. And then the moment came while these two fused together. They fused into Stefani. The Crystal Gems say that it's impossible for a human to fuse with another human. And considering that we get an episode involving Greg trying to fuse with Rose, which didn't end up happening, this is a really unexpected discovery from the Crystal Gems. And believe me, it really makes this episode a lot more interesting to actually see the fusion of Stefani in her first appearance. And yes, I am aware that Stefani is a different person despite the fact that it's a fusion of Steven and Connie. I'm trying to understand the facts of this show in general. Garnet told Steven and Connie, in other words, Stefani, that this is an experience in order to understand how fusion works. And the words that she told Stefani to do is to have fun. So the majority of this episode is just Stefani just going into Beach City, into the fusion form, and trying to understand how fusion is an important experiment that they need to be accustomed to. I really like every single bit of this episode from beginning to end, mainly the fact that they actually gave us, the viewers, an understanding of how fusion shouldn't be always about stopping crisis situations. It's considering that this is Steven dealing with fusion and trying to be accustomed to it, while also Connie doing the same thing what Steven is doing, despite the fact that she's not a crystal gem like him. It makes this episode really good to see these two being in the fusion while also becoming like a teenager or an adult, because for some reason, due to the fusion, they grow taller, which in my opinion, people have been saying that this is way too confusing, considering that multiple fusions don't need to make you go a bit taller. But since that we see that Sapphire and Ruby fuse into Garnet, which is taller than them, I honestly think that the world building of fusion might be confusing, but at the same time, it's not that bad whether you completely get into the ideal. Whenever I watch Stefani on screen, no matter what episode it is, I can instantly tell that they try to make Stefani a different person, despite the fact that it's a fusion of Steven and Connie. In the scene where Stefani meets Lars and Sadie, they're instantly having a crush on Stefani, despite the fact that it's just a fusion. To me, even if this is mostly the fact that both genders of male and female are in a fusion together, and the connection could be a bit confusing to other people if they don't get the full story. But watching this scene really sums up that they want to have Stefani its own character, kind of like Garnet is her own character when she's in a fusion with Sapphire and Ruby. Now, yes, I am aware that the person can read other person's minds when they're in a fusion, so that they can look at any of the things that the other person did during their journeys. But at the same time, considering that they're trying to keep it a secret from anyone and actually seeing the fusion being in its own character, it really makes you understand the fact that Stefani is actually a different character compared to Steven and Connie. Granted, it's debatable whether you say that this is the same character, except the fact that it's a fusion of Steven and Connie, but at the same time, I still consider a fusion character an original character when it comes to how they're dealing in the world outside. Besides, it really shows that other fusions that other characters fuse with, they have a different personality no matter what. It's like completely having a character in a video game, and then when you're stuck to that character with a personality, you're just gonna have to accept it. Granted, this episode isn't about acceptance, it's more about having fun in the fusion. But at the same time, if we actually did have an episode involving a fusion that you're not into, but at the same time you have to deal with it, it would be mostly interesting. But like most of the production in these episodes, it just never happened. Anyway, Stefani gets invited to a rave party going on in one of the buildings in Beach City. And consider that Stefani is in the same age as the other teenagers in Beach City, it really goes to show that anything is possible when you're in a fusion. Now, this is where one of the characters, Connie, in this, is dealing with the struggle of dancing in front of everyone, since that she hasn't danced before. Now, for me personally, I did went to dance parties in my past, and I haven't danced into any one of them. But if I did, I can tell how stressful it is in order to not embarrass yourself in front of so many people. So I can understand that Connie is just dealing with the stress while Steven is just trying to get into the fusion. And we get the introduction of Kevin. I'm just gonna say this right now that every episode involving Kevin is all Connverse episodes. So this is the first time I'm ever gonna be talking about him And the next times I'm going to be talking about him, he just gets worse and worse. But I'm just going to say right now that in his first appearance, he is alright. I mean, he doesn't know that Stefani is a fusion, and the fact that he wants to dance with her is just something that a cool guy would do at a dance party. And due to Connie slowly taking over the fusion, Stefani is really paranoid at this. Believe me. Being with a dude, despite the fact that you're a child in a teenager's body, is honestly a really difficult task to actually not embarrass in front of anyone, especially with a cool guy in the dance party. So, I can understand the struggle that Connie is dealing with, and the fact that Steven's just trying to make things right, for not only for Connie, but also not embarrassing herself. In considering that she stated that dancing someone with a friend isn't the same when you're fusing with someone, really shows that Connie actually wants to be with someone, since that she wants more experience on dancing. But at the same time, since that she never danced before, and the fact that she's gained experience, it's honestly difficult to dance with someone who is hitting on her. So yeah, it's really impossible to actually get past through this in order to actually get the dancing right with someone who's a close friend. And considering that Kevin isn't a close friend, really shows that you can understand how much that Steven absolutely despises Kevin in the next episode that Kevin makes an appearance in season 3. And when they're about to dance with Kevin, their dancing is honestly way more awkward and really difficult, considering the fact that they're just basically two children in a teenager's body that just doesn't understand how dancing works when you get older and older, which not only disturbs Kevin, but the fusion of Stefani and Connie is completely done. Well, not really done forever, but done in this episode. Which actually had everyone see the bigger picture on this whole fusion thing and caused Kevin to run away, which is pretty much the only good thing that he does in this episode, is that he actually has some standards in the world that he's in. Although that doesn't excuse what we're going to see his performance is like in the next 2 episodes. Trust me, season 3 and season 5 is where we get to see Kevin at his worst. As for Steven and Connie, they laugh and joy as they dance together as the episode ends. A really weird way to end off this episode, but then again, this is the first time we get to see Stefani, so I can really tell that this is a moment where we get to see Connie just completely thrilled and actually have fun with the fusion with Steven, and she's willing to dance with Steven even how unprepared she is when it comes to dancing. This episode isn't better than Indirect Kiss, since I rate that episode a 9 out of 10, but I'm rating this episode an 8.75 out of 10, which means that it's the second best of the Connverse episodes. And believe me when I say this, is that this episode alone really actually made me appreciate fusion and also the relationship of Steven and Connie. They did 2 plots and they execute them really good in this episode. And I gotta say, the later episodes, despite the fact that they're not as better as the earlier episodes, really did a good continuation involving this arc. If I'm ever going to discuss what I actually enjoy about fusion, especially from Stefani, I will probably do a top 10 list on the best fusions from Steven Universe if I ever got the chance. And I will add Stefani onto the list, definitely, because as far as I'm concerned, this episode really shows how good that fusion is. So that's basically part 1 of the Connverse Anthology. I'm going to get back to this anthology either in June or in the future, depending on what I actually feel during that time. But who knows? I just really hope that I can actually make this video before I get to my June schedule of this year, that is. Yeah, I'll plan ahead of time, but that's what I do. I'll see you guys next time, and I hope you enjoy Valentine's Half Month 3. I know I was mostly disappointed that the first part of this anthology series didn't get much attention, especially that I was looking forward to it once it's uploaded, but on the other hand, I really don't consider this as a major loss. For one thing, I really don't know what to reveal involving the characters of Steven Universe, and compared to characters like Lapras, Peridot, along with other characters who have different character arcs that are mostly debatable, I really need to actually be prepared if I'm actually going to talk about their character arcs in the near future. But as of now, I'm still going to focus on the Connverse shipping between Steven and Connie. By the way, if you want to know onto why I'm not adding love letters since it's also a Steven and Connie episode, it's because Connie doesn't appear much in that episode, and it's not really a growing relationship. It's mostly a Garnet episode at most. Granted, people can debate on that episode being mostly about how Steven and Connie are not completely lovers yet, and it's mostly a growing relationship until they fall in love when they get older. But on the other hand, whenever I see Garnet on screen in that episode, it's mostly a Garnet episode where she takes most of the spotlight, while also the fact that the Beach City citizens don't know who the Crystal Gems are at that time. So anyway, here's my reveal on Winter Forecast, which is the first of 5 episodes I'm reviewing for this video. Connie gets a call from her mother that she needs to head home immediately because of the snowstorm that's coming. So Greg and Steven decide to help her to get back to her place before it's too late. This episode is really nothing special. Compared to the episodes I reviewed before, this episode is basically a character just trying to take another character back home safely before the snowstorm gets a lot more complicated. But before Steven and Connie head outside to Greg's truck, Garnet kisses Steven on the forehead, which leads to him getting future vision later on. So in the majority of this episode, Steven can see the future of what could have happened if he doesn't make the right choice. Which I have to admit, compared to what Garnet did along with the others in Fusion Cuisine, all because of Steven and Connie leaving, this is basically the best of what she can do in order to help Steven in his relationship with Connie. Not to mention the fact that Greg needs to grow some kind of an interaction and relationship with Connie's parents in order to have Connie come over to Steven from time to time. I was being a bit harsh in Fusion Cuisine, but at the same time, at the end of this video when I talk about Nightmare Hospital, you will probably be looking forward to me to say something positive involving Connie's parents. Anyway, Greg got crashed into something after his van was slipping on the road, and with no other option, they decide to walk all the way to where Connie lives. Unfortunately, her parents freak out because of how late it is, and her mother is completely paranoid because Connie got a cold. Yeah. I will usually go against them like I did in Fusion Cuisine, but on the other hand, I can easily be on their side for once. Just when the two are about to sleep at Connie's for the night, Steven saw a star pattern behind of Greg's outfit, which he got a headache of. And he wakes up only to find himself inside of Greg's van with Connie by his side. And this gave Steven an idea for what they can do. He decides to make sure that he stays in the van with Greg and Connie just to make sure that Connie doesn't get a cold. Let me tell you, when it comes to Garnet's powers of future vision, she really knows how to be way more limited, but also try to help Steven be more mature the more he gets older. Not to mention that there's also an alternative universe situation where Connie's father almost crashed into Greg's van, and that could lead to, let's just say, serious injuries or death. And thank the Lord that Steven's future vision given from Garnet actually bring him back a few minutes before. So Steven wakes up only to see himself be with Connie and Greg just before they leave to go back to Connie's place. And this episode gets a lot more better when Steven takes Connie with her so that she can stay with him for the night to prevent the snowstorm. But when they get inside the beach house, they see poor Garnet and Amethyst trying to warp the shooting star to the galaxy warp. Otherwise, it was self-destruct. And since that they got distracted by Steven, it caused an explosion when the star hit the ground. but thanks to Garnet's future vision, it never happened. After seeing everything from the future vision, Steven made a head start by taking Conley immediately to Greg's van without any stops along the way. And what I mean by that, the accidents that ended up happening in the future vision. This episode has a basic plot, but this episode became a lot more better thanks to the help of Garnet and the Crystal Gems. Let me tell you that if there are other episodes involving the Crystal Gems helping out Steven, it makes the episode a lot more entertaining. Even though that this episode isn't mainly focusing on Steven and Conley's relationship, what makes this episode important is that Steven needs to make the right decisions before it's too late in order to stay with Conley a little bit longer. Because even if I didn't like Fusion Cruising that much, the very least I can give it credit is that it can have some kind of continuation when it comes to the other characters' development, and that includes Connie's mother and father. Like I said, they have every right to be outraged of what's happening to their daughter for being late and completely cold while also having the flu. And in all honesty, compared to their appearance and their development from Fusion Cruising, even if they don't do much in this, they still have the right to be criticized against Greg and Steven for being late. And just to get this out of the way, I am going to be reviewing the filler episodes involving Connie's father. And let me tell you, even if that episode is mostly filler, just like most of the other filler episodes as the series goes on, it's still kind of important to have Connie's parents to be part of this Anthology review, since that they actually grow some development between them and their daughter. Granted, it's going to be a lot more weird to be reviewing those episodes as part of Steven and Connie's relationship, but compared to Love Letters, it's literally the right choice to review those episodes instead of that episode. As for the ending of this episode, since they're on time before the snowstorm got worse, they're allowed to sleep over for the night. And compared to what we've seen in the alternative sequences, it really makes me appreciate Connie's parents a lot more. And before you ask, yes, I'm fully aware that they do have names, but I can remember Connie's father's name, Doug, but as for her mother, it's a difficult name, and the sad thing is, I'm gonna have to remember her name by the end of this video. This episode is a really good episode, even if it's mostly about Steven just trying to stay with Connie a little bit longer while trying to have her parents to give an understanding of what he's trying to do. Granted, this episode isn't as bad as the other episodes I reviewed as part of the first installment of Connverse Anthology, which is the first 5 episodes, but on the other hand, it's still harmless for what it is, and I can guarantee you that if there's going to be another episode that's trying to take similar inspiration on current circumstances, they can take inspirations from this episode. I give this episode a 6.5 out of 10, and as for the next episode that is going to be reviewed, it's going to be a major improvement, just by this one screenshot. This screenshot alone really made me appreciate the storyboard writers of this show despite the mistakes they made along the way, because they really know how to handle the relationship between Steven and Connie by being into Rose's room while a Cloud Connie, which is the one in the wedding outfit, takes down Steven. And believe me when I say this, is that is a prime example of how much they put so much thought and effort into this relationship. Steven had finished reading the final installment from one of Connie's favorite book franchises, and he doesn't know what to describe it unlike what Connie thinks, and what Connie thinks about the ending, she really didn't like it. Steven also stated that he also didn't like the ending of the book, so they decided to go into Rose's room and so they can recreate the ending of their own vision. Usually when it comes to people doing these types of decisions, regardless of what they feel about the ending of the book, it's mostly relatable, because even if I don't usually do this type of stuff when I was in kindergarten or in middle school, we usually just try to make up some random things in order to entertain ourselves. And this is basically what Steven and Connie do. They go to Rose's room and turn into the characters from the book series. Connie, on the other hand, can't make any wishes in the Rose room because Steven's literally the only character who can easily be accepted to make those wishes. So he wishes a store, a costume store, so Connie completely goes in and then change into a character from the book. But unfortunately, this isn't the Connie from this episode. This is the Connie who's a Cloud Connie, which is something that Rose's Room has when it comes to making Steven's imagination. And this is where the episode is starting to become a lot more interesting, because Steven doesn't want everything to be his way because he's afraid that Connie won't enjoy himself, so he tries everything to have Connie her way so that she can have fun. Usually with these types of plots, I can easily understand with characters like Steven just trying to do the right thing by having Connie be more entertaining. Again, this is the same person who barely goes to school, and he's more of a crystal gem than a human. Granted, he's half crystal gem and half human, or half diamond, whatever you prefer. But every time I watch these episodes after watching Future and the originals finale, it made me appreciate Steven's character a lot more. Granted, there were a lot of questionable writing decisions, but on the other hand, every other cartoon always makes questionable decisions, despite that they go a little bit overboard. And let me tell you, after discussing all that in my first Steven Universe video of this year, I really need to tone it down, because at this point, talking about it less here will probably be for the better. And what makes this a lot more interesting is the fact that Connie in this is actually the Cloud Connie. In Storm of the Room, where we get to see Rose, except that she's a cloud form, that's basically what Steven thinks of what her mother is like, and of what Steven actually thinks of Connie in this situation. He wants to make sure that Connie isn't any of that in the real world. Because let me tell you, that is basically the biggest highlight of this episode when it comes to the relationship. Even though that this episode premiered 5 years before the episode where Steven completely proposed to Connie, it really made me understand that Steven's just trying to make sure that he doesn't make a slight mistake. Granted, he did it in episodes before this, but compared to a relationship like this, it's always something that Steven needs to learn from his experiences, because this is at a time where Connie hasn't been a sore fighter yet. Well, in about 2 episodes when we get to that, or 3 if you want to count love letters, which I don't. And the fact that Steven is just trying to deal with how the entire world that he's living in isn't all about happiness or full of love, since that he's experiencing more about the crystal empire, about the gem empire, and the situations that he's gonna get himself into as season 1 comes to a close. Even though that when it comes to other relationships from other cartoons, the Steven and Connie relationship is just trying to slightly make improvements and trying to move forward when it comes to the new things that these characters have to learn, and the fact that they're trying to get to know each other a lot more compared to other relationships from other cartoons. Granted, I'm over exaggerating, but considering that these episodes are 11 minutes long and not 22 minutes long, they really know how to balance out the time between the relationship and also the runtime of each episode. Anyway, just showing this screenshot again, well, Steven admits that he actually likes the ending of the book, but he doesn't want to say that because it might offend Connie in some other way. This image alone really shows that Steven just isn't ready for, you know, what's gonna end up happening. Granted, it is mostly debatable that this isn't mostly about the romantic relationship as of now, but compared to the episodes that we've seen later on, and since that this show is officially over, looking back on this episode, it really has dated a little bit when it comes to of how Steven just proposed to Connie 5 years later, and the fact that he was ready, but at the same time still too early to be proposing to someone who is 14 years old. I can guarantee you, if Connie was actually in the wedding dress the whole time and not the fake one, this episode would have been a lot more awkward and very unpleasant. But considering that this is Rose's Room and a lot can happen when it comes to Steven's imagination, they really know how to up their game, and it's really a shame that everything we've seen in Rose's Room won't be something that can happen in the real world. And I'm talking about the storm in the room between Steven and the fake Rose. And when Steven admits that he likes the ending of the book, Kai says that it's just a book. Opinions are opinions, and we always need to be civil. Something that this episode also teaches a good lesson. And to be quite honest, the fact that Connie just doesn't understand what Steven actually thinks is actually a huge relief, because as far as I'm concerned, if this is actually something that will have happened later on in the series, this episode will probably be a lot more difficult to watch when it comes to how growing the relationship is between Steven and Connie. As for the remainder of the episode, it's mainly what it is. For the majority of it, it's mainly the fake Connie chasing Steven, and Steven and Connie, the real one, or the cloud one, just trying to make up their own ending and trying to make the book a lot more better from their vision. Which is, again, something that we usually do, but on the other hand, the ending actually makes this entire plot a lot more better when it comes to how improved the relationship is getting. Like I stated, this episode is one of my favorites when it comes to this shipping relationship. And even though that the episodes are going to be much more better than this, we just need to accept that the fact that this episode really changed when it comes to the later episodes, if it's done in a good way. And I am talking about how Steven is growing as a character, and he's just trying to do what's best for not only for himself, but also for Connie. But anyway, since that we're all done with the first season, I'm going to give this final episode of Season 1 involving Steven and Connie an 8 out of 10. And as for the next episode for Disclosure, well, we are entering the second season of Steven Universe. The episode takes place right after the Season 1 finale, and this is where everything, makes so much changes involving Steven's life, and the fact that he has a huge responsibility he needs to be accountable for. Since that his recent adventure had been a lot more devastating compared to his previous ones, he knows how serious this is, and this is also the beginning of Steven's trauma that's going to be building up in the ending of future. And let me tell you, the fact that Steven is just trying to avoid Connie at all costs is something that you would usually do in this situation if you're ever into a difficult time that isn't like what Connie is going through, or like what the other characters that aren't the Crystal Gems go through. And that includes Greg, since that he's also the father of Steven, even if he's not a Crystal Gem. In one of my original scheduling of reviewing these episodes of this series, I wasn't originally going to add this because this was mainly about a Steven episode where he has to deal with a midlife crisis and also just trying to keep Connie safe. Oh, wish I thought, because after watching the next episode and the episodes after that, this episode actually feels important regarding to of how Steven is trying to grow as a character, while also Connie just trying to be a lot more respectful involving the life that Steven has. For me personally, this episode really made me underestimate of how much Steven is as a character when it comes to dealing with this trauma and stuff. If anything, Steven is just trying to mature himself and trying to make sure that no one, especially Connie, gets hurt. Because in episodes before this, everyone in Beach City evacuated because of what's going to happen. And the fact that Steven made the decision of getting back to Beach City in order to help the Crystal Gems, who are his guardians, really made me actually understand of what Steven is dealing with and what his motivation is in this episode. Granted, this episode isn't 100% perfect because, Leonardo, the conspiracy theory, and he's only doing it for his own benefit after his conversation with Steven. But other than that, I really think that this episode really didn't become one of the most dragged down episodes, all because of that moment. Even though if I did review the Leonardo episode, which is one of the worst episodes from the show, just because of those one appearance involving Leonardo doesn't mean that this episode is one of the worst. It's obviously the most opposite if you look past that. But then again, people always look past of minor details like that, so what am I saying? The song for Disclosure, which is one of the first songs I'm talking about in Steven Universe in general, is a really, really entertaining song, and it really furthers the plot of this episode. The flashbacks we've seen in the previous two episodes, while Steven sings over those flashbacks, really makes the song a lot more better when it comes to of how Steven is dealing with. Granted, I wouldn't say that Full Disclosure is one of my favorite songs from the show, but for what it is, it's highly underrated. I know I keep saying underrated a lot, but at the same time, there are so many alternative words that can be described a lot more differently when I talk about other things. And for me personally, with the songs I've seen from this show, this is a lot more underrated while others are just much more better. And besides, the ending, I understand is supposed to be taken seriously, but it's actually hilarious because you would think that Steven would talk to Connie after the song, but he ends up hanging up, and it's actually kind of hilarious while he just completely ignores her. I understand it's supposed to be taken seriously, but for the way it's executed, especially watching this for the very first time, it's still really humorous to me. But anyway, I need to get to the bit where Steven and Connie actually do meet after the whole crisis situation. Connie arrives at the beach house just to meet Steven, but unfortunately, Steven sneaks out, avoiding her at all costs. She saw him before she leaves and she follows him, and she demands an answer onto why Steven kept ignoring her. And this is where this episode is starting to become one of the most memorable moments involving Steven and Connie. He tells her that she doesn't want to be with her anymore, and Connie refuses to leave unless if Steven tells her to her face, so that way she can get back to her normal life. However, Steven had a change of heart, something that she refuses to let Connie go because of his big responsibility. With this being the 8th episode of this arc, they really know how to carry on the plots of the relationship of trying to completely have a reconciliation between the two characters. Granted, I don't usually use that word that much because it's a very strong word, and the fact that it leads to a lot more realizations between the characters. But what makes this a lot more entertaining is the fact that Steven is dealing with a serious crisis that he needs to handle by himself, but at the same time, this is also the beginning of Connie's new development that we're going to be seeing in the following episode of her next appearance. Or the next appearance after the appearance, because Love Letters came out after this, and the next episode I'm going to be reviewing next is after Love Letters. But still, I've seen some fans who complain that Connie just isn't the same as she was by the time that this episode came out when it comes to her development later on, and she didn't remain herself as a bookworm. But on the other hand, if they completely kept Connie like this, she wouldn't continue any arcs or the development of her relationship with Steven, because if the series continues on and she doesn't do much, she will probably be forgotten as the series continues. Let me tell you that when it comes to shows who do relationships like this, there has to be changes, otherwise the characters will become more blander and probably be more forgettable as the series continues. And it really explains onto why the first season had so many episodes and it kept dragging on way longer when it comes to starting in November 2013 and ending in March of 2015. Granted, it was hiatuses getting in the way, but on the other hand, I really think that those hiatuses actually meant something, since that they tried to put a lot more effort when it comes to the first season of these characters. Granted, if I did watch the show, I would actually be surprised if I noticed that this episode, Full Disclosure, is the first episode of season 2. But on the other hand, I wouldn't be that complainable because this show was still building up its characters and trying to make this entire world building a lot more serious than memorable. And considering that I did say serious, the seasons later after the first season become a lot more complicated, but in a good way when it comes to how it's executed. Anyway, I really appreciate this episode a lot more, especially the creativity it has when it comes to building up Steven and Connie's relationship. I did say that this is my favorite after reviewing the last two, so I give this episode an 8 out of 10. But since that there are 2 more episodes left, the next episode is way better than this. If there's anyone, I repeat, anyone who despises the shipping and say that Connie doesn't deserve to be a Swordfire and should remain the same as she was in the previous episode and in the first season, then you don't even understand how much this show really does when it comes to character developments. And believe me, I did saw those comments, don't correct me. Steven and Connie are enjoying themselves by playing their instruments, and when Steven is about to eat his brisket, seagulls are about to attack him so that they can have the brisket, but Connie stops them by using one of the tour instruments that she used as a sword. Yeah. This episode has a really good introduction when it comes to Connie in this episode. Connie wants to be a really good swordfighter because she really loves it. So, since that we know that Paul is a great trainer when it comes to sword fighting in the first season of the show, Connie and Steven head to Paul for some training exercising. And yes, I know and I'm aware that this is also a Paul episode, but that's not going to change my mind that this is still a Steven and Connie episode. Since that Paul is just trying to get an understanding of Steven and Connie a lot more when it comes to them getting along, and this is at a time where the relationship is growing bigger and bigger to the point that this whole friendship relationship or a family relationship is becoming a huge factor of this show, then I'm pretty sure that this episode, talking about Paul in this episode, won't bug me whatsoever. In fact, I was hoping that I can actually review one of Paul episodes in this show eventually, but apparently I didn't get the chance to do it because of schedule changing. Paul takes Steven and Connie to the ancient Sky Arena, where she can train Connie to become a swords fighter. And for the majority of this episode, is Connie improving herself to become a better swords fighter, while Paul saying do it for her, which I'm gonna get to later. And to be quite honest, this episode has a really good turning point when it comes to the plot, because when you completely look at the song Do It For Her, it really shows that Connie is changing for what Paul wants her to be. And let me tell you, since that this is Paul who has a obsession with Rose, you know that things are just gonna go out of hand when it comes to Steven. He talks to Garnet and Amethyst, and they stated that Paul was doing the same thing with Rose by protecting her, but apparently there were so many Pauls that kept getting destroyed, and Steven is gonna be in the same shoes with her mother, while Connie basically the same way with Paul, which really paranoid Steven to the point that he would instantly lose Connie in a battle. He tries to stop Connie, but Connie tells him that he's nothing, and she's doing everything to keep Steven safe. And this is where the episode really makes it a lot more interesting and probably one of the best when it comes to the second season, if people have debates. Let me say that the whole Gem Empire is really what makes this second season a lot more important, since that it's focusing on that, unlike in the first season where it's mainly about slice of life stories. Granted, the first season is mostly a mixed bag when it comes to what it is compared to the later seasons, but what really makes this episode a lot more better is the fact that they actually know how to make better developments and changes for the characters, including Paul. If any of you are wondering, no, I repeat, no. I'm not against this whole lesbian relationship between Paul or Rose, no against it or completely enjoy it, because even though that it's a contributing factor in the show, I can consider it mainly a great contributing factor to the relationship to Connie and Steven. Because just by looking at the Do It For Her song, you can really tell that Paul is just really desperate to make sure that Rose doesn't completely get killed or completely get destabilized. Believe me, it's honestly a really difficult life to live if you're a crystal gem like Paul. Even if Paul didn't have the most promising development compared to Garnet and Amethyst, I don't consider her as the weakest crystal gem in the main cast of the show. Granted, I can guarantee you that they could have done much more with her by moving forward, which they didn't do in the final season of the show, and I'm referring to future, I still think that she's still a mostly tolerable character for what they're trying to do, involving her struggles with the Empire and the present time with his whole relationship with Steven. And one of the reasons onto why she's doing this to Connie to become a better swords fighter for Steven is because she wants to respect Steven a lot more. Let me tell you that Paul did a lot of terrible things towards Steven, which explains onto why in some of the episodes involving Paul and Steven, she broke into tears on the fact that Steven still likes her for who she is, and being pretty cool like Garnet and Amethyst. Granted, it is debatable on which episode you prefer when it comes to Steven's pairing with Paul, Garnet, or Amethyst, but for me personally, I think that the Steven and Paul relationship actually made me a lot more understanding of what they're trying to do. You can say that Garnet or Amethyst are better mothers compared to Paul, but on the other hand, just because Paul had the less development when it comes to these characters, I'm not going to uncredit her for being a mother towards Steven, because let me tell you that she's still a good mother regardless when it comes to what she's trying to do, what's best for not only for herself, but for Steven in general. Do It Just For Her isn't one of my favorites, since I discussed that Full Disclosure is better, but on the other hand, it actually continues on how we actually feel evolving this whole situation that Paul is dealing with. If Connie actually took her word and the fact that she completely did what she did, then everything will probably be a lot more out of control, and I can guarantee you that Connie's mother will have every right to be overreacted. And speaking of that, the following episode is honestly what I'm going to be discussing soon once I'm done finishing this episode. But as for the song itself, I think that it's still a really sweet song for how they completely execute the scenery and the lyrics sung by Paul and Connie, especially what it leads up to at the end of this episode. Steven decides to defend Connie because he has a shield, and they do everything they can to actually snap Paul out of it so that they can actually talk sense into her. But unfortunately, Paul is too obsessed with Rose to the point that she is desperate to have Connie be like her. But Steven is not going to stop there. And the bit when we see Steven and Connie walking together is just amazing. One of the best moments from the second season of the show. And let me tell you that this is honestly the greatest development between Steven and Connie's relationship when they're working together instead of just hanging out together only. And that really makes a lot of the later episodes a lot more approving when it comes to what we see these two characters do when they team up together. And as for this episode ending, since that Paul actually exposes that she was only doing it for Rose since Steven is actually Rose, she came to a realization that she actually went a little too far, and then Steven apologizes for her to thinking that what she's doing was basically best for himself, which really wasn't the case whatsoever. I can guarantee you that this is the development that I actually like from Paul. It's just a shame that as the series goes on, the other characters, mainly Garnet and Amethyst, got more development compared to Paul, which is honestly a shame. I've always discussed how much I really appreciate Paul's character and how disappointing she was when it comes to the other characters' development, but I've always discussed that a lot as it is. So all I can say is that besides that, this episode was very good compared to the episodes I reviewed in this video. Even though it's going to take me months to get back to this Anthology series, I am still going to be looking forward to reviewing the episodes involving Connie becoming a sword fighter, along with the many introductions and appearances from newer characters. Well, not really introductions, but mostly appearances, if you know what I mean. So I give Swan of the Sword a 9 out of 10. There's only one more episode to wrap up, and that final episode is Nightmare Hospital. I know I've been judgmental towards characters who are strictly, and just by watching my review of Fusion Cuisine, I guess that me discussing that episode was a bit too harsh, even if my opinions stay the same. But after watching this episode, they probably made that episode that way just to make this episode a lot more entertaining, but also really heartwarming between Connie's mother's relationship with her daughter. I wouldn't say that this is one of my favorite episodes when it comes to reviewing these types of episodes, but all I can say is that it's really underrated and also probably one of the most powerful heartwarming moments between Connie and her mother, since that she actually learns of what Connie has been doing since that she's been with Steven since the series began. Steven and Connie head back to her place, and Steven had this idea by giving Connie her mother's sword. Yeah. And considering that this is also a reference to the second episode involving these two characters about swords and somewhat, this is actually kind of a good follow-up of what they did in Lion 2, the movie. Connie promises that she'll take good care of the swords, but when her mother is about to head into the living room, Steven tries to take the sword to put it back into Lion, but unfortunately, Lion is nowhere to be seen. So they completely use a sword as a disguise, like they use it as a coat hanger, but unfortunately, that didn't last long as Connie's mother took notice. She demands an answer onto where she found it, and all that Connie said that she found it on the floor and she wants to show it to Steven, but her mother still refuses to have her use the sword because of how dangerous they are. Usually, I would easily think that this is over-exaggerating, but since that Connie is actually learning to becoming a sword fighter, and the fact that this is still at a time where her mother is still restricted, this is honestly bound to happen eventually. Even if this is taking place right after Swan of the Sword when it comes to Steven and Connie's relationship. And I know you guys are getting sick of me saying that, but at the same time, do you seriously want me to say Connverse every single time? Because for me personally, it's really not appealing other than labeling it as the title of each video I upload. As in these limited videos. Anyway, Connie's mother gets a call from the hospital that she's needed for a serious emergency, so she takes Rose's sword with her, so Steven and Connie needs to take the sword and put it back into Lion's mane. And this is where the episode is starting to become The Walking Dead. Seriously, the lighting and the fact that we get to see the introductions of new creatures really makes this episode a lot more serious, since that it's also evolving Connie's mother into the mix. Connie's mother is trying to work with a patient she's trying to work with, but apparently she can't hear any heartbeats whatsoever because the patient she's working with is actually a cluster gem. Just when Connie's mother tries to find better earmuffs so that he can hear the patient a lot more better, Connie and Steven tried to get the swords, but unfortunately, Connie's mother caught them red-handed while taking the swords away from them. However, the cluster gem is about to wreak havoc while causing the other characters to run away from harm's way. And this is where Connie and the mother are having arguments with each other over the restrictions. And let me tell you, this was obviously a long time coming. Granted, Connie didn't make a stand for herself in Fusion Cuisine, but just by looking at what she's doing in this episode, it's probably a long time coming, which explains onto why they put more focus on this episode, unlike Fusion Cuisine, which is the introduction of Connie's mother. With so much crazy stuff going on with each episode we get to when it comes to binge watching, which I did, this show becomes a lot more chaotic and a lot more dangerous when it comes to the PG rating. Granted, there were a lot more stuff that happened in the first season when it comes to the beachy waiting, but this is where things started to become a lot more darker than usual. Granted, Connie's mother isn't the only human who is witnessing the gem crisis situation, since that the beach city had to evacuate in the season 1 finale, but on the other hand, unlike those characters, Connie's mother is dealing with the realization that what is going on involving the cluster gems and the fact that her daughter is a source fire made her really understand that her restrictions mean nothing to her the more she learns about being a better person. Granted, she wants to have Connie be a better person from her own point of view, but at the same time, Connie doesn't want it. And let me tell you, with the addition of the cluster gems who also appeared in this season, really makes this episode a lot more better when we see the conversation between Connie and her mother. Steven tries to confront Connie's mother, but apparently she denies, which eventually causes Connie to snap. She directly told her mother that she didn't need glasses over years since that they don't have lens at all. And considering that she went through a lot of adventures and situations involving Steven, and the fact that when it comes to fusion, which she didn't explain to her mother, which I don't know if it's actually a missed opportunity for Connie's mother to actually realize this, but that, along with her not finding out that Steven proposed to Connie, which she accepted just not early enough, is probably something that I will probably see involving Connie's mother if they actually did those ideals. But getting back on topic. After taking Connie's demand, Steven took down the bubble that he was used to protect him, Connie, and her mother, and they both take down the cluster gems. And this is where Connie's mother finally realized what is actually going on between her daughter and Steven. Let me tell you that every time I think of Connie's mother in the newer seasons, even though that she doesn't make more appearances than I thought, I still think that she actually did a really great change all because of this episode alone. Connie also stated that she's been lying to her mother so that she can do the things that Steven would do. And let me tell you, if you're ever in this situation with Connie, you will probably understand what it feels to not do any of the activities of what your friends would usually do. And it really shows. It is honestly unbelievable if without Connie being a sword fighter, she won't be able to do any of the stuff with Steven, which really shows onto why her becoming a swords fighter really makes her development a lot more better. And the end where we see Connie and the mother hug it out and making agreements not to lie while also lift restrictions so that they can actually give an understanding of each other really made me appreciate Connie's mother's character a lot more. Granted, it's a shame that she doesn't make more appearances as the series continues, but considering of how this episode is executed compared to Fusion Crucian, I think it really shows. As far as I'm concerned, it's really a shame that we don't get to see a lot of recurring characters when it comes to Connie's mother, along with other characters we've seen from the show. Granted, it's mostly debatable on the developments, but on the other hand, other than the Beach City citizens, which I do like when it comes to, with the exception of some, I still think that Connie's mother is probably the most interesting out of the bunch. You can say that Laws deserve a lot more development after he became a crystal gem in the 5th season, but keep that in mind, that was in the 5th season, while this was in the 2nd season, and this was almost 2 years before Laws turned into a space zombie. So as far as I'm concerned, I really think that Connie's mother was the first that should probably get the most development, aside from the crystal gems. Say all you want, even if I watched the show after it ended, I can still find some new things regarding to of how the characters feel, especially when it comes to the relationship arcs. And this is why this is a Steven and Connie episode, because it's mainly focusing on Connie's mother, just trying to understand who Steven really is, even though that she really didn't do a lot of research involving the crystal gems, especially meeting them for the first time in Fusion Cuisine. When it comes to the final episodes involving this show, I might consider on reviewing Glowing Plants, which isn't really much of a Connie and Steven episode, but on the other hand, it still involves the arc since that it's the aftermath of how Steven got rejected from Connie. And this actually leads to a point where Connie's mother is a little bit suspicious, and it's really a shame that we don't get to see more of that. But that was mainly about Steven's trauma, so when it comes to both ways, I'm pretty sure that if we did have more episodes involving Future, there will probably be an episode involving Connie's mother again. But also about the whole proposal situation that Steven made to Connie. But then again, as usual, it's mostly for fanfic ideas, and I only did 2 Steven Universe fanfics by the time of this recording, so I really think that me thinking up this idea could work, except I've already did an epilogue of I Am My Monster. So anyway, I give this episode an 8.25 out of 10, and that's wrap up for part 2. I doubt I'm going to be getting back to this Anthology series by the end of this year, but when we enter in 2022, I'm definitely going to get back to this Anthology series. Just don't worry, I'm still going to continue it despite how long it's going to take me to finish all the episodes. Even if this is claustrophobic after uploading all my Christmas videos of this month, don't really expect me to do something, at least something special during the final week of this year, because let's be real, I'm still having plans on reviewing Steven Universe in January, and I'm planning to wrap this entire anthology up in February. And considering I'm reviewing 6 episodes instead of 5, which my original plans was 5, mostly because one of the episodes wasn't worth reviewing on when it comes to my perspective, it really shows that rewatching these episodes are a lot more important than getting straight into reviewing these episodes. So the first episode I'm going to be looking at is Steven's birthday. It's Steven's 14th birthday, and the shocking thing is, Connie realizes this to think that Steven was like 10 or 11, but apparently he's 2 years older than her. For me personally, after watching Steven Universe Future and the movie, it really made me understand the struggle that Steven is doing in this episode. If I did watch this episode back in 2015 or 16, I'm pretty sure that my perspective will probably be mostly towards the comedy and mostly of how Steven is learning how to handle his abilities as a gem. But then again, this is the 2nd season. And considering that this is still a Connverse episode, it really sums up of what Steven needs to deal with in the future involving his relationship with Connie. But for what we have in store in seasons 5 and onward, believe me, there's going to be a lot to discuss, but we'll get to that in February. So, Steven wants to impress Connie because the fact that he won't be able to grow up because he's still part gem. And with the gems not having the ability to age, it's gonna be a lot more complicated once Connie becomes president and Steven thinks that he will be best boy or first boy. And when he saw Amethyst using her powers to have long legs and long arms, he gets an idea which, considering that he is half human, isn't a good idea. Upon the birthday surprise from Steven's family, he completely grows his arms and legs, making them just like Amethyst but not completely stretchy. And considering that this is something that he has to deal with for the rest of the day, and this leads to a consequence that has a limited recovery, as in taking about less than 12 hours or so, I really think that Steven really didn't know what to do involving growing up, unlike other humans do in Beach City. Let me just say that Connie in this episode Despite the height animation errors, let me just say this right now, I have an issue with the animation in the later seasons involving the character's height, but in all honesty, this show is trying to be mostly Ghibli, but it's not really working when it comes to the main episodes compared to the shorts. Anyway, Connie's development in this episode being a lot more straightforward compared to her previous appearances, since that she is getting impressed by Steven's height and the fact that she is aware of what's going to happen in the future. I really have a feeling that if Steven never got older in the movie and in future, I'm pretty sure it will probably make this relationship a lot more odd to see Steven as a little child, even if he is 14, while the other characters have grown older and older than him, but more specifically Connie herself. And considering he's gonna be in this position while being by Connie's side for the rest of his life, believe me, it will be difficult to have this adjustment be active in this position. If you really believe me of how Steven wants to grow up at the same time he can't because he's part Gem, believe me, I'm pretty sure that his trauma that's gonna be explored in the later seasons really sums up everything of his character development. Not just with his relationship with Connie, but also his character himself. But unfortunately, that didn't last long as he turns into a baby due to him staying in that position for way too long. I would consider this cute, but considering that it was really painful for Steven to try to be more taller than Connie, I really think that I can easily pick a different alternative by staying in the way of who I am. Granted, the lesson of this episode is that it doesn't matter if you're tall or shorter than Connie. Connie will still come with Steven during his adventures regardless. Not much compared to the other episodes involving Steven and the Crystal Gems, but at the same time, knowing of what it has in store for the later seasons involving Connie and Steven's relationship, and I do mention seasons 5, I'm going to try to find some other ways for Connie's justifications of her choices in those seasons. But at the same time, just by watching these two characters, especially from this episode, which is the final episode of season 2 involving their relationship, I can say that it's a good wrap up. Seasons 1 and 2 really represents the beginning arc of Steven and Connie. Granted, you can say that it somewhat ends in the beginning of the second season involving them making an agreement after Steven tried to avoid her. But the thing is, I'm pretty sure that Connie becoming a sword fighter, along with her parents somewhat making agreements with her, I'm pretty sure that this episode is basically the real wrap-up involving the first half of Steven and Connie's relationship. And considering that we're halfway wrapping up this anthology, it really sums up onto why I'm reviewing 6 episodes and probably more in the following part depending on what happens. So I give Steven's Birthday a 7.5 out of 10, and as for the following episode, Beach City Drift, we finally get back to a character that I've last discussed since the beginning of this year, and that character is Kevin. And considering that I've mentioned before that he only appears in the Steven and Connie episodes, his presence in this episode is, if not a lot more difficult to adjust compared to his previous appearance. Since that we all know that he misunderstood Stefani as Steven and Connie, not to mention that he was hitting on her without her being fully okay with it, he still decides to hit on Stefani even though that he's aware that it's a kid and a girl in an adult's body, or just a gem fusion, but you all know what Stefani is. Let me talk about the rivalry between Steven and Kevin, even though that Kevin doesn't have anything against Steven, but Steven does have something against Kevin. Knowing that Steven is in complete hatred with characters like Kevin, but not the diamonds, let me just say this right now, I'm pretty sure that he really hates fancy cars or anything, and mostly fancy, hip people who completely think that they're better than everyone else. Usually, I would empathize Steven's choices of what he likes and what he doesn't like, but considering that this leads to a bit of contradictory with his encounters with other characters as the series goes on, I really feel like that he really doesn't even know what Kevin is other than him just hanging on Stefani, which was his first encounter with him. Greg said that Kevin isn't really worth it, especially for someone who instantly hits on so many girls. Let me just say this right now, every other person who is Kevin will always hit on a girl that he sees in first sight, mostly love at first sight, but in his own version of love at first sight. And knowing that Connie does hate Kevin, but at the same time not the same way as Steven does, she always keeps her emotions to herself. Usually this type of development made me understand Connie a lot more compared to how she acts towards later of the series, but knowing that she is willing to help Steven becoming Stefani while also face Kevin in a car race, I really don't know what to think involving Connie's development in this episode. I can only assume that even if Stefani is still a different character, it doesn't change the fact that Steven and Connie's minds are still part of Stefani regardless, and Steven's, which is the other half of Stefani, thinks that Kevin is stealing Connie from her, even though that Connie is the other side of Stefani. I really think that it really feels a lot more awkward to think that Steven is dealing with Kevin stealing Connie, even though that it doesn't make a difference because he is part of Stefani. I don't know, maybe it's supposed to be a love triangle, but at the same time it really isn't, because that really isn't the case whatsoever involving Kevin's development. Yes, I am fully aware that Kevin is hitting on Stefani, which does make sense for a love triangle, but the thing is, he isn't a simp. Because even if he's trying, he knows he isn't a simp whatsoever. Because unlike Mordecai, Finn, and Panda from Adventure Time, We Bear Bears, and Regular Show, Kevin is way ahead of their lead. And considering he's doing all this just to mess with Stefani while having her being unfocused with the race itself, let me just say this right now, he's probably doing a lot just so that Stefani would cry so that he can hang out with her. Granted, that's not really what he's trying to do, but that's what I'm thinking, judging for how he's being portrayed in this episode. And knowing that he somewhat understands that Stefani is a fusion of two children, it's going to be a lot more difficult to find any enjoyment from this character, except that he is done portrayally good as a somewhat antagonist. He may not be a villain, but he is still a beach city antagonist. And if you ask me, that really sums up Stefani's development in this, is because even when Steven and Connie are fused together, they're still having a difficult time working together and adjusting the fusion. And believe it or not, this is the second episode I'm reviewing involving Stefani. In the second part, I did not discuss anything involving Stefani because there was no fusion whatsoever. So I have to be real with this being the second Stefani episode, despite having fusions of her in the past. I really feel like that this episode's biggest highlight is Stefani herself, especially since two children are actually driving a vehicle, even though they do not have a driver's license. And the more I think about this, the more I can easily feel sympathy towards Steven, but also Connie, in this race that they got themselves in. And when they learn that they do not have to play Kevin's game whatsoever by getting trolled at, I have to admit, the ending of this episode really feels satisfying, but also interesting, involving Stefani's development. And the fact that Kevin really feels like he got rejected by a girl that he has a crush on, despite the fact that he is never going to get the goal really sums up of how it's going to be in Kevin's party. And even though that episode has a lot to discuss, me discussing Kevin in that episode, since that his name is in the title of the episode, I'm pretty sure that there was really no point to have him in any other episode other than just being an obstacle for not only for Steven and Connie, but also Stefani. So, even if this episode isn't as better than the last episode, I feel like that this episode does a lot more involving Stefani, and the fact that it does follow the development and the relationship of Steven and Connie. Then again, I'm reviewing nearly all the episodes involving the Connverse episode, so expect the unexpected. I give this episode a 7 out of 10. Gem Hunt. Well, even if I did not review the somewhat Christmas episode involving Steven Universe, since I skipped that last year and I'm going to be doing the same thing this year, this is somewhat of a Christmas episode, even though that there's no Christmas related, but the snow, that's at least something. Even if I am done with my Christmas videos, I still have something winter related since that we're finally in the winter season. Anyway, Connie is going on her very first mission with Paul and Steven, and it's in a winter wasteland. Believe me, the fact that we get an episode involving Connie going on an actual adventure after the wars are not restricted involving her family, I really feel like that they could have done a lot more in later episodes involving this ideal. But let me just say this right now, considering that the production involving Steven Universe is a lot more mixed compared to other productions of TV shows, I really feel like that this episode really feels like the only episode where Connie is on an adventure, but at the same time, it isn't supposed to be the only adventure she went on, because she did tag along with Steven in Season 5. It's mostly because of how the show is focusing on other characters, so I can easily understand that. But knowing that after watching these episodes and knowing that Connie is actually, well, Connie in this episode and being a lot more respectful with Steven, it just makes me questions on what the later seasons would have been like if we actually see actual development involving her struggle as an explorer like Steven is in almost every other adventure that he went on with the Crystal Gems. Getting back on track, this episode is mostly about Steven, Connie, and Paul trying to find more corrupted gems in the Winter Wasteland, and they decide to split up, leaving Paul by herself while Steven and Connie work together to find more corrupted gems. If you binge watch all the episodes up to this episode, we all know that Steven cannot fix corrupted gems completely, and considering that he needs to figure out some other way to help fully corrupted gems by not healing them, it really shows that the corrupted gems do have more abilities that can easily turn them back to normal, or just trying to have more meaning of their existence. Knowing that of how much that this show portrays the crystal gems or the corrupted gems a lot more different from each other, especially the episode where Garnet is afraid of force fusion, I'm pretty sure that even with Connie on this mission, there won't be any difference. I mean, Steven has the ability to protect Connie with his bubble powers, and considering that they gave Paul a walkie-talkie so that they can call her in case of needed help, it really shows that if Amethyst and Garnet are in this episode, they will probably be in Paul's position regardless. And the biggest reason onto why they split up is because there are too corrupted gems wandering in the wasteland. If you really think that if they have the other crystal gems to help out, then this episode wouldn't be an episode. It would be just like a crystal gems adventure with Steven. So I really feel like that they're trying to figure out some other ways, or the fact that the other gems are in different locations to find more corrupted gems. But then again, that's mostly their job at being crystal gems. But when it comes to this episode, it really shows that Paul still needs help even though that she really doesn't need the help from Steven and Connie. All that she wants is to have a call from either Connie or Steven about one of the corrupted gems. But all this leads to is them encountering Jasper herself, and I'm going to discuss her character in the following episode. But let me just say this right now, the fact that the following episode is actually part of the Connverse episodes, which I'm actually surprised. I really feel like rewatching these episodes really sums up of how important they are compared to what happens afterwards. So, all in all, I really feel like that they actually knew what they were doing involving Jasper's appearance in this episode and the following episode. Since that the corrupted gems were running away from her, and the corrupted gems were attacking Steven and Connie because they think that they're about to attack them by the noise that they're causing. I can guarantee you that if it wasn't for Jasper's small cameo appearance towards the end of this episode, then this episode will probably be a lot more worthless, while making the following episode mostly about Amethyst and Jasper. Granted, Steven and Connie are also in that episode, but knowing of how much that I've rewatched that episode in preparation for reviewing it for this video, I really feel like that this show's all your seasons, especially this, has really come a long way. So once we get into the following episode, I give this episode a 7.25 out of 10. The following episode, Crack the Whip. Granted, whether you say if this still being an Amethyst episode that involves her development in the following episode where she faces Steven, it still really feels like another Connverse episode when it comes to Steven and Connie working together and becoming the fusion. Just to point this out, in the last episode, Gem Hunt, they did not fuse together. And this is the second to last episode I'm going to be reviewing involving Stefani in this video at least. Pearl and Garnet are doing more gem hunting involving more corrupted gems, and since that Pearl promised that Connie can do sword training with her, apparently she has to scrap that so that she can focus on her mission with Garnet. So, while they're gone, Amethyst is taking care of Steven and Connie, and mostly Lion. So for the first half of this episode, Amethyst is training Steven and Connie, but mostly just her goofing off while the other characters have fun at Beach City. Nothing else other than the second half being mostly a contributor towards the episode's title. But considering that this is still an Amethyst episode at the end of the day, I should probably discuss Amethyst because, let's be real, I really feel like that after doing 3 videos involving Steven and Connie while reviewing the most episodes involving Steven and Connie, I'm probably never going to talk about the other characters, so I should probably discuss Amethyst's development in this episode. I'm pretty sure that her development in the later seasons, especially this, is a lot more lackluster compared to how she was portrayed when other characters got more development than her. I understand it's difficult to have every other character being fully development, but to be honest, Amethyst isn't really much of a big loss. Granted, I do like the episodes centering around her in the first season and maybe the second, but when it comes to her appearances afterwards, she is still a comic relief, even though that she is still a crystal gem that Pearl and Garnet found. Now, I need to make one thing clear. I can understand that Amethyst's character can be a lot more different when she is mostly a gem that Pearl and Garnet kept over the last several years before Rose turned to Steven. But I really feel like that the way that she gets less development than the other gems, I really feel like that she probably had to miss opportunities compared to other gems that didn't get any development. And believe me, Lapis, despite the fact that she had less development as a gem of her own, probably had a lot more established development than Amethyst. Granted, it is mostly depressing to see that Amethyst is in a position where she's mostly different from every other gem, but at the same time, it really feels like the animators are just focusing on her facial expressions and the humor that she provides. Usually, I can understand what people would feel involving her character, especially from other perspectives, from other people, but just by watching this episode of the fact that she wasn't able to take down Jasper because she got poofed by Jasper, which leads to Stefani and Lion taking down Jasper, it somewhat makes the following episode mostly a closure of Amethyst's arc. Granted, I can understand that it really isn't the case because I did not watch other episodes for a second time, but at the same time, I do not binge watch the entire series a second time, only once. So, just to get this out of the way, I do not plan on reviewing the following episode, Steven vs. Amethyst, next month or anytime soon, because even though that it does involve Amethyst's arc involving a crystal gem, but at the same time, there really isn't much towards her character as the series goes forward. But as for Jasper in this episode, since that she is similar to Amethyst but also an antagonist, I really feel like that they did a great job to making Jasper probably a lot more intimidating even after her fusion with Lapras is completely over. It is really impressive to think that Amethyst doesn't stand a chance against Jasper, especially in the form that she's in. Believe it or not, I really feel like that Jasper really does make an interesting threat when the diamonds are mostly out of the picture, while we completely see Jasper doing most of the work. It really astounds me of how much that they really put so much effort into Jasper's character in seasons like these. When it comes to future seasons, well, she remains the same, except that she is still somewhat of an anti-friend or an anti-enemy or a frenemy with Steven, especially in the final episode. It really makes Jasper one of the characters to not change completely, but at the same time, not wreaking havoc on any obstacle that comes her way. And the fight scene between Stefani and Jasper is probably the most interesting compared to seeing her facing off with Amethyst, because judging of how much that she poofed Amethyst and the fact that Steven and Connie needs to fuse together in order to take down Jasper, and the fact that they somewhat defeated her, it actually makes this more of an accomplishment that Steven and Connie can be able to work together. But let me just tell you, this is also further proof that even with Stefani, they can't be able to take down any obstacle involving corrupted gems or anything on Homeworld. And let me just say this right now, it's going to be a lot more difficult to believe that Connie ends up leaving Steven for nearly a month or 2 weeks just because she wasn't able to be with him on Homeworld. I do have my own predictions of what I feel could have been much more better when it comes to better writing decisions, but I'm going to be saving that for the following video. I may have gone too long by discussing this episode mostly involving Amethyst and Jasper, but to give this episode credit for being somewhat of a Connverse episode, I really feel like that this relationship between Steven and Connie really sums up of what they do in the following episode, Mindful Education. But before we get to that, I need to discuss one more thing. If it wasn't for Stefani taking down Jasper while taking Amethyst's gem before she gets taken away, I'm pretty sure that this episode will be mostly involving Amethyst, because if this episode is mostly about Stefani being much more powerful when it comes to her training, and the fact that Steven and Connie actually are working together in order to save Amethyst from getting taken away, I really feel like that this episode does a really good job by having the other characters have somewhat of a focus, even though in the majority of this episode, they're mostly getting trained by Amethyst. In part 1 of this anthology, I did mention I was going to be skipping on a few episodes because they didn't really feel important involving Steven's relationship with Connie, but the more I watch them and the more I understand their relationship and development, it really sums up that almost all the episodes are actually important. Granted, the Garnet and Jamie and the Jamie-centered episode while Steven and Connie are reading Jamie's book aren't really that important involving this relationship, but after rewatching this episode, I can guarantee you that part 4 is going to be a lot more complex with the amount of episodes I need to put my focus on involving Connie's presence in those episodes. But let me tell you, this is still my first ever anthology minus the Shaolin Showdown trilogies. Since I'm focusing on multiple episodes in one video and I need to save this project for a later time in multiple parts, I will need to expect the unexpected, which I'm probably gonna experience once I do more of these videos in the future. I'm giving this episode a 7.5 out of 10. Now here's an episode that you've been looking forward for me to review once you clicked onto this video. Mindful Education. This episode not only develops the relationship but also Steven and Connie's character separately, since we all know that these characters never had any other friends except each other once we got into Bubble Buddies, which was the very first episode of Connie's appearance. Connie is having a difficult time focusing on her training when she made a huge mistake at school by attacking Jeff, who is one of the students in her school. And let me just say this right now, if you can easily tell that Connie is really the type of person who wouldn't do that to anyone and having problems with, then you do not understand how lonely she is. It's already established that Connie has always been alone before Steven got into her life. And considering that she has developed a lot more as a person and more of a sword fighter, then believe me when I say this, is that you'll probably be in Connie's position if you was this lonely and you hung out with someone who can easily understand why you're feeling this way. And that person is Steven himself. But even with that, Steven is also dealing with trauma once we get into the final minutes of this episode. But I'm gonna get to that later. Garnet tells Steven and Connie to fuse into Savannah so that she can talk to her. And this leads to her singing a song called Here Comes a Thought. Believe it or not, every time I think of Garnet in this episode and the fact that she contributes the advice she gives to Savannah, all the while showcasing the relationship of Ruby and Sapphire, I really feel like that without Garnet in this episode wouldn't be this good. If anything, it will probably make most of Connie's problems a lot more complicated if she doesn't get any advice from any of the crystal gems. Especially the song being almost 3 minutes makes this entire sequence a lot more interesting, since that most of the songs in the show are really well done and really good to be placed in. And if you don't believe me, then go look at my review of Steven Universe the movie where I just review all the songs towards the end of that video, because even if I did say that they're mostly unnecessary, that doesn't mean that they're out of place. And considering that Steven Universe does a good job into making these songs in place in these episodes, then I don't think that Rebecca Sugar wouldn't been a good songwriter if she completely scraps the songs from the show. Granted, if I ever get the chance to review each song, it would take a long time, but at the same time, I really feel like that each song does something a lot more meaningful in Steven Universe. But getting back to the song and the scenes involving Connie's struggle, I'm pretty sure this is the closest way we're ever going to see a character involving Steven Universe that isn't Steven, that we actually get to see some development outside of Steven's perspective. Because we did see Connie completely attacking Jeff, and the fact that it happened during her surroundings at school. But the thing is, since that we barely knew how she spends her time at school, and the fact that this is the only episode where we get to see bits of her school, even if it's just mostly during this sequence, then we can actually see her development a lot more fleshed out completely. And believe me when I say this, the fact that the more I watch these episodes and the more I try to get an understanding of the criticisms of what people have expressed towards characters like Connie, mainly from this season, I really feel like that they really knew what was the biggest problem involving Steven Universe when everything is mostly catered to Steven when it comes to his perspective. Granted, in the beginning of the episode while Steven's just trying to mess with Connie that he's bald, even though that he isn't, Connie doesn't really care whatsoever because of what she did at school. If Steven was mostly pointless in this episode, then I can easily tell that this is definitely a Steven only's perspective that really damages this episode. But since that we have a few minutes until the episode ends, we get to see the struggle involving him. Well, it's mostly centering around the other Ruby, sorry I forgot her actual name, with a gem as one of her eyes. His encounter with Bismuth, which I did review 3 months ago, and not to mention the whole Jasper situation that he's dealing with, and also his mother. If you really think that if none of this ever happened in this episode, then I'm pretty sure that Steven wouldn't be able to contribute much to this episode. And since I've watched all the episodes, including Future, along with other people's reviews on one of these episodes, and the fact that it centers around Steven's trauma, then I'm pretty sure that for an episode that aired in 2016, foreshadows Steven's huge breakdown or meltdown towards the end of Future, despite most of what people think towards that sequence, this really has aged a lot more better compared to what people would usually think. Granted, I can't tell that people can easily see this episode the same way compared to the later episodes that they've seen involving a single pair of roles and such. Then I'm pretty sure for a fact that despite their analysis, they really miss most of the details of what the other episodes had in store. Granted, I don't usually blame them, considering that it's their own perspective of what they feel towards episodes like these, but in all honesty, people just don't understand what children are like whenever they have development like these. Granted, the pacing of this episode is mostly problematic, considering that in the final minutes of this, we don't get somewhat of a good conclusion involving Steven and Connie dealing with Steven's trauma whatsoever. And even though that it's mostly about moving on and not fixing everything and completely hurting everyone, I really feel like that Steven is really the type of character that just doesn't understand the meaning of moving on, but also moving forward, which is something that he quite somewhat forgot in Future. But let me tell you, once we get into the Future episodes in the following video in February, it's kind of obvious that the ambition involving characters like Steven, they always have an other side of their personality. And considering that most characters are two-faced at most, I really feel like that every other person in any other cartoon will always have the other side. Granted, I've would discuss the trauma involving Steven, since that there's still more in Future, but the thing is, it's really not that much of an important deal whenever I completely see Steven in this state, and the fact that moving forward is going to be a little bit more complicated. Yes, I did see so many videos involving this issue involving Steven, but the thing is, if you really see of how he's portrayed in earlier seasons, and the fact that people just pretty much didn't experience the trauma that Steven dealt with, because, well, wars, even if they did exist in the past, but in wars from outer space, it never happens in the real world. But if it did, including all the stuff that he went through before and after this episode, Steven isn't SpongeBob. And since I've mentioned SpongeBob in this type of topic, well, he isn't really that intelligent and he's mostly over the top when it comes to his personality. Steven has some of the similar traits involving SpongeBob, where he's mostly happy but also doing what a kid usually do. But the thing is, this isn't the Bikini Bottom or anything involving underwater. And the fact that people are mostly against this whole Steven's trauma thing, despite the fact that they have good reasonings, you will probably not understand what it feels to have a character be in this position if you feel sympathy towards that, if you've ever been put in that situation. Granted, when you look at it without any of that issues, I can understand, but at the same time, if you knew how dangerous it is, then I'm pretty sure that the execution, despite being really flip-flop when it comes to screenwriters, then I can't say that this entire show is terrible because of the final seasons and the Connverse just flip-flopping the scripts. Because let me tell you, I can understand that this show fell from grace, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that I can consider it as a mediocre show. Besides, thinking about that would probably be a lot more redundant for the amount of shows that completely drop in quality with the final seasons. So just seeing the ambition in this show, I can easily give it an A for effort, even though that it could have been a lot more better if they actually had a constructive narrative. But then again, it's difficult to have a constructive narrative, whether it's a movie or a TV show. Granted, it needs to be almost 50% constructive when it comes to a perfect perspective of what people want to see from a character, but other times it's mostly hard to keep track of everything of what people have been waiting for since the delays of Steven Universe. Granted, I'm not one of those people who had to wait this long for a new episode to come out, only to learn that it's a Beach City episode, but unfortunately, even by watching all the episodes, it still proves that this show has less constructive narrative when it comes to the characters and how the arcs needs to be completed. So, despite what people think about this episode being good or bad, I still think that this is the best episode I've seen in this video. And in all honesty, I really feel like that giving this episode an 8.5 out of 10 is a lot more better than giving it a much more higher score. I can easily admire the characters or what they're feeling in this episode, but when you completely think about what people feel towards the development in this episode, then you probably don't understand what it feels if you can instantly feel the struggles from those characters. Yes, every human in the human race can't agree on one opinion, but at the same time, whenever they just look at most of the negatives, it's mostly difficult to understand where they're coming from. So, all that's left for this video is to reveal Dugout, which is, well, Doug Maheshwaran going on a stakeout mission with Steven and Connie by her side. Usually, it's mostly those episodes where you expect the father character to deal with the struggle on being a good father, but the thing is, this is the same Doug that we've seen since his first appearance in the first season of this show. Even though that this is still a filler episode involving the problems of seasons 3 and all world filler episodes had, and maybe seasons 2, but I can't say that this episode is worthless. Since that this is the first time we get to see Doug Maheshwaran after the events of the second season, I can't say for a fact that this episode really mistreats his character, since that he's just trying to be a better father after his wife lifted off most of the rules of her relationship with Connie. When it comes to Doug himself, I really feel like that his motivations, regardless of him being the best of his abilities to try, and mostly desperation, I really can't blame him regardless. If you really think about how he's just trying to be a better father after everything that happened in seasons 2, I'm pretty sure that you'll probably be in his footsteps if you ever have strict rules and you come to a time where you decide to lift off most of the rules in order to have more of a close relationship towards your son/daughter. In the scene of Storm in the Room where Connie's mother picks her up from Steven's house, we don't get to see Richard whatsoever in these scenes, and it's mostly of how the writers or screenwriters or storyboard writers or whatever are giving a little bit development involving Connie's mother, since that she really cares towards Connie a lot more after she completely lay off the restricted rules in the family. So, seeing Doug in this episode trying to be a good father by doing a stakeout mission, even though that he's not doing the best job at it, I really feel like that the fillerness in this episode is mostly done for how much that they just don't know what to do with Doug, unlike Connie's mother, who is mostly better developed since we see her interactions with Connie in seasons 2. If you really make me to believe that Doug is supposed to be all of what Connie's mother is, then you're expecting a little too much involving Doug in this show. Every time I think about this episode and the one time involving Doug and the kids, which makes me to believe that this is still a Beach City episode, even though that it doesn't involve any of the Beach City citizens, I can instantly tell that they just didn't know what to do with Doug in this show, even if there could have been potential if we get to see a few episodes centering around him and his wife on what they're feeling at the moment involving their daughter. But let me just tell you, even if I do have potential ideas for that, I don't think that they would easily work out for a show involving Steven and the fact that his friend Connie is willing to go on adventures with him. I'm just saying, I understand that people are really interested into the crystal gems, but when it comes to the Beach City citizens, even though that Doug and his wife isn't a Beach City citizen, I can't say that they really need more episodes for further development. They only need a few episodes and that's that. Granted, the filler episodes in the later seasons may be a bit irritating, but if you ask me, I really feel like that they're still harmless at the end of the day. It's just that most of the slots that these episodes are in order really feels a lot more difficult for people to find enjoyment when the attention is mostly into the major plots of the show. Granted, I can't say that for what's happening after Steven came back to Earth after going into outer space, and this is before he goes on trial. I really feel like that the episodes in season 4 are mostly harmless. But when it comes to season 5, jeez, it's probably going to be a very long video once I get back to this story arc, believe me. Anyway, I better wrap this up, otherwise this video will be longer as it is. I'm giving this episode a 6 out of 10, and what I have in store for the final episodes of the Connverse, believe me, it's gonna be much more longer than I'm really concerned of. And whenever I say that, it's mostly of how much I need to give an understanding between the characters and the arcs that they're gonna be dealing with. And believe me, this anthology could end up fine or turning out ugly, or somewhat both. Let me tell you, I've been thinking of doing a part 5 of this, but the thing is, I do not want to pressure myself to doing more of these, knowing how difficult and long they are to make. And considering that I have different perspectives on the final episodes involving Steven and Connie, it would be better to make this the final part rather than just being the second to last part. Because believe me when I say this, even if this video is going to be way longer compared to the last 3, I'm pretty sure that, for an extent, I'm pretty sure that this ship is still intact even to this day, despite most of the decisions during production. So even if I already talked about the final 4 episodes of Steven Universe's Future last year, which involved Connie in those episodes, I'm still going to mention her towards the end of this video involving her purpose, not to mention the final scene between her and Steven before Steven leaves Beach City. Believe me when I say this is going to be a lot more interesting when you completely look up how these characters are mostly developed, but on the other hand, it's either for the wrong reasons. I'm pretty sure it's no surprise that the first episode I'm going to be talking about today is Dewey Wins, which it's an episode where people are totally against, knowing that this completely pushed away most of the development involving laws from outer space and a way for Connie to take Lion with her in order to have Steven prevent himself from going to meet laws from time to time. But in all honesty, if you completely ignore about the law and just look at this episode as its own thing, I really feel like that they're trying way too hard to put Steven in the wrong by having him be mostly out of character while trying so hard to have Dewey win the election. It's no surprise that in the beginning of this episode, Connie is mostly broken in the inside because Steven had to turn himself in without her help. Knowing that these types of characters never went to a place like Homeworld before and they encounter a few gems beforehand, I don't understand what Connie really expects if she ever went to Homeworld in this position instead of later on in the series. I can understand that she wants to be a better fighter and try to be a good ally with Steven, but the thing is, I don't even understand why she would feel this way, knowing that Steven is trying to focus on what's really important rather than just doing the painful alternative. Even though that Connie is a better fighter compared to the Beach City citizens, she doesn't really understand how Homeworld is going to be like when she gets there. And knowing that the fact that she ends up getting her sword destroyed later on, even though that's technically Steven's mother's sword, I really think that her being in Homeworld won't easily work out. But when it comes to an alternative idea by having her be part of Homeworld, I came up with a solution in order to make this plot work, but I'm going to save that for Kevin Party. Getting back to this episode, Nanofrot demands to be male, knowing that she can be a much more better male compared to Dewey, since that he isn't fully aware about the whole invasion that happened probably a few days ago, or just a day ago. But in all honesty, the fact is that Nanofrot actually has more knowledge of what is really going on, and the fact that Laws is missing. And considering that this is mostly depressing of how the Beach City citizens are dealing with turmoil due to the whole invasion that just happened, it just makes me question onto how male Dewey ended up becoming male before the series. Granted, you shouldn't really question the characters when it comes to their introductions, but on the other hand, I really feel like it's mostly accurate after watching all the episodes involving Dewey, even if he only appears briefly in this show. One of the key examples onto why this episode is somewhat of a Steven and Connie episode is because what Steven is doing in this episode, where he eventually gives up at the end, is what Connie is feeling in this, because she wasn't able to do it. Because she didn't get abducted thanks to Steven. I understand that Connie wants to be somewhat of a helpful ally, but that doesn't mean it's supposed to be an excuse for having her not making any phone calls with Steven whatsoever. Not to mention that the fact that she didn't even bother to bring Lion back to Steven. If you ask me, this type of loophole or storyline convenience isn't really convenient when you compare a look at the major issues involving this plot. Look, around this time, there's going to be a huge battle between the diamonds and the crystal gems, which it's a good setup, I will admit that. However, if you're gonna include Connie into her own drama by just having her ignore Steven, even though that Steven is trying way too hard to do the right thing in this episode, he did the right thing in the final episodes of Season 4, and even though that what he did really hurt Connie, there was still no excuse for Connie to just completely leaving Steven out of it for so many weeks. It's just difficult for me to actually think that Steven really deserves this punishment, even though that he didn't have any alternative choice. Look, at times I do admire the personalities and the feelings whenever they're properly executed. However, the fact is that this episode took place right after Steven escaped from Homeworld and back on Earth. It won't be a possibility if Steven won't be able to head back to Earth if it wasn't for Lars sacrificing himself. I'm pretty sure that Connie should probably give an understanding onto what is actually going on between Steven and his problems. And knowing that this actually leads to him, as always, just trying to fix everyone else's problems, Connie should probably focus on this problem on her own with her parents if she is willing to think about what's best for her, but also what's best for everyone. Let me tell you, I really think that this entire episode is just trying so hard to put Steven in the wrong, even though that he's somewhat in the right despite being mostly in the wrong. Even though that people are going to make the argument that this type of development would work if it was properly executed, knowing that Connie deserves a little bit more better by not being abandoned by Steven after he decided to turn himself in, you need to really think about how this entire arc just really wasted so many potential ideas. And I'm pretty sure that anyone who sees this issue will probably think that this episode doesn't really need to exist. I mean, male Dewey not being a male anymore with someone passing the torch as being male is somewhat understandable. It was somewhat bound to happen, but it could have happened somewhere in Season 3 or Season 4, and it didn't need to involve Connie into the mix. I can say that this episode is somewhat good on its own, if you ignore everything, but with the addition of Connie along with the other plots happening that is being overshadowed by this episode definitely deserves a 5 out of 10. But when it comes to an episode on its own, it's mostly a 6.5 out of 10. You know, when I start a video with this type of style that involves a Beach City episode, but at the same time, it really just pushes aside major plot lines and just trying so hard to put Steven in the wrong regardless of his decisions, it just really sums up onto why I really feel like that this shipping at this point isn't really the best when it comes to Connie's development. Then again, we have just started, so let's get into the following episode, Gemcation. Since it's been a while since Connie wasn't able to respond to Steven's texts, it's gonna be really difficult for Steven to move on from this. Mostly the fact that Connie is the only human friend that he ever had. I know it's mostly awkward to think about, but knowing that Steven never went to school or did anything outside in the outside world, I really think that this is pretty much one of the biggest examples onto why Steven is feeling way more depressed, and his decisions in this episode are really justified. Look, I'm fully aware that this is the episode where Steven needs to move forward in order to make himself feel better, and the gems are just trying to give him a vacation to calm himself down, especially of what's really happening at the moment. But in all honesty, I don't really blame the crystal gems whatsoever, since they're mostly focused on the whole diamonds coming to Earth situation that's going to be happening pretty soon. Granted, I can't really go against the gym since that the motivations are understandable, but when it comes to Steven's motivations, how did anyone forget that he wasn't part of a school or had actual friends aside from the crystal gems, since that this show is trying to take some real life issues and try to translate them into this show? Believe me, if you were like Steven and you never had a school or any friends whatsoever, and you only have one person who's a human friend who only spends time with you whenever she comes over to your house, you will probably feel sympathetic like Steven in this. Granted, this entire episode's purpose is that Paul is mostly aware that she's going to expose her secret involving the Rose Quartz being Pink Diamond, but knowing that that wasn't really the case in this episode and she's mostly relieved that was actually something else, this episode really makes me convinced that they're trying to make us feel a lot more sympathetic towards Steven, and yet at the same time, there was not much payoff whatsoever. The fact that Connie is just ignoring him for literally nothing. And I do mean it that way, because as far as I'm concerned, this is, well, at this point, this show should have had actual writers. Let me tell you. Knowing that this show had storyboard artists and the fact that they never got an actual writer to do nearly one of the episodes, it really sums up onto why this show is instantly divided by the half of the fan base who hates Steven Universe. I know some of you guys are getting a little bit annoyed of me talking about the divide side of the fan base, but if they see one of the issues of Connie being a jerk to Steven by ignoring him for so many weeks, and then we get a payoff that is really lackluster, then I can't take this episode seriously. At least Dewey Wins actually had some structure, even though that's mostly a beach city episode that you can enjoy as its own thing. But with this, the fact that it just wasted 11 minutes involving Steven's depression over Connie that could have been much more better executed involving the other plots, then I'm pretty sure that what Steven is doing in this episode, I can't instantly go against him. It just doesn't really work for me when you completely don't see all the characters when it comes to the Steven only perspective thing going on through the majority of the series. But that's literally the only problem I have with Steven in this episode. Let me tell you, if I have no opinions involving the Crystal Gems and Greg just trying to cheer up Steven, even though that the motivations on trying to focus on other current events is way more important, and the fact that the ones who raised Steven, and even though they do not understand what it's like to be raising a son, then I'm pretty sure they can understand their characters a lot more compared to what people would think of them. Granted, some of them may be underdeveloped, but on the other hand, those are stories for a later time. I give this episode a 4.5 out of 10. Well, I've been waiting to talk about this episode since the very beginning, last year to be in fact. And knowing of how this is where people instantly turn their back on Connie for how she was betrayed, and after so many episodes, we get a conclusion that is so lackluster. I'm just gonna say this right now. This episode didn't really need to happen. I'm being serious. Even if this is supposed to be the final part involving this entire arc, involving the breakup, there is still no payoff regardless, because can this show at least get one or two writers? The whole plot of this episode is that Kevin invited Steven and Connie to his party so that they can fuse together into Stefani to make his party a lot more popular. Now, pushing aside the fact that Kevin has only 3 appearances, major appearances in this entire show, and this is his 3rd, and afterwards he never appears ever again, I feel like that they're trying way too hard to put Kevin into this entire plot, but at the same time, he doesn't really need to. Knowing that his purpose in this is just trying to have Stefani appear at his party, and even though that he isn't losing her so that he can be her boyfriend or stuff, I really feel like that at this point, they just didn't know what to do with Kevin after his first appearance and his second appearance. Usually when it comes to these types of characters, I'm not really expecting much, but at the same time, I really feel like that his presence in this episode is just to have Steven and Connie come together, even though that his true purpose is to have Stefani be present in his party. But it just raises the questions onto why Connie would even bother to go to Kevin's party to begin with. If she really doesn't like Kevin that much, wouldn't she be better off doing something else or go to a different party that actually makes her feel happy? I understand that Connie is like Steven in this. Well, she doesn't have any friends growing up due to her restricted parents. Wouldn't she just go to the library to cool her depression? Because in all honesty, that's literally one of the only things I would think Connie would do in order to calm herself down after what really happened. I just don't understand onto why Steven and Connie would bother to go to Kevin's party, even though that his intentions is just trying to get them together to form into Stefani, but on the other hand, it didn't really work out for him at the end. Then again, I'm not expecting much involving Kevin's character in this show, even after his final appearances, so no offense, but Kevin is still Kevin regardless. I have no positive things I can think of him, but when it comes to the negative stuff that I've just mentioned, I really feel like that his best appearance in this entire show was Beach City Drift, but that's about it. At this point, I really do not have anything to discuss Steven's character in this episode. He has been in the wall for so long that at this point, I'm just gonna keep repeating myself, so let's get into Connie's side of the story onto why she wasn't having any contact with Steven after all this time. It's bad. What do you really expect? It's really, really bad. Her excuse is that she was trying to contact with Steven by going to his house, but apparently he was on vacation so that she wasn't able to. And the fact that she was planning to talk to him all along, except that she didn't do that towards texting because that would end up talking to him even though that she didn't want it to. I want to make one thing clear is that I am aware that Connie is like Steven when it comes to her not having no friends whatsoever. But seriously, does she ever improve on social communication or something? What makes her reasonings a lot more difficult to believe is the fact that she isn't fully aware what Steven is feeling at the fact that he never went to school unlike her. I don't understand onto why she would feel this way in order to have Steven take care of the problems for her. Let me tell you, out of all the characters that Steven should need to take care of everyone else's problems, Connie is definitely one of them, because he has done that for so many times in the past that at this point, after so many development between the two characters, it shouldn't have come to this. It really shouldn't. After Mindful Education, that is where both characters' development should be fully maxed out. Okay, not really fully maxed out, but mostly being bygones and stuff like that. The whole Steven trying to do the right thing with Connie, even though that he kind of did by turning himself in, but then when he comes back, it just doesn't work out for him. It just makes Steven mostly all over the place and just can't able to come up with conclusions of his own, since that he won't be able to make things right for either for himself or for Connie. And even if this was leading up to what's going to happen towards the end of the series, this isn't really one of them, to be quite honest. Because Steven isn't feeling trauma in this, she's just feeling depression, but in the wrong way compared to what he's feeling in future. This episode drags out for way longer than it needs to be, even if it's in the same length as every other Steven Universe episode. However, there was still no payoff. It just isn't. Steven and Connie going back together doesn't really make this entire reunion good. It just makes everything else completely worthless. Since people have always talked about of how Connie's character has been mostly butchered in this position, I will say this though. Here's my alternative take of how this should have went down. Connie actually comes with Steven and Lars into outer space into Homeworld. It may be a difficult thing to believe, but believe me when I say this, it will probably work out. After the trial episode, Connie tries to convince Steven that they got this together, but Steven told Connie that this isn't simple, and considering that Connie isn't fully aware of Homeworld itself, she isn't on the same board of what Steven and Lars are feeling at the moment. And instead of having her swords getting destroyed in Reunited, have her swords get destroyed by one of the drones after the explosion. Since it killed Lars, I'm pretty sure it can destroy a sword in some other capacity. Believe me when I say this, as much as that scene between Connie and Blue Diamond in Reunited was really cool, I really feel like that it wasn't really much effective knowing of how Connie was developed due to the route that the production took. With Rose's sword destroyed along with her and Steven back on Earth, she feels like she was actually defeated and failed on her mission to help Steven, which leads to her being away for a while, just like the real version of this story, except that she actually contacts with Steven by calls and texting, except that she needs more time to herself than anything. When it comes to them reuniting, they made a decision to work together, but at the same time, mostly on Connie's trust and feelings of how she can improve on herself while trying to be a better fighter, even though that she really has a lot to experience in order to take down the diamonds. But the thing is, knowing of how this series ends off with the diamonds reconciling, which is still difficult to believe, I'm going to assume that if Connie actually got her real sword, as in her own sword, way earlier instead of later on, it would have been the better choice. If you ask me, this episode really sums up onto why I really did not like this arc whatsoever, just like everyone else's. If you really make me to believe that if I actually watched this around the time it was airing, I'm pretty sure that I would probably come up with this solution a lot more earlier than anyone else. But at the same time, I really feel like that this wasn't really the end of Steven and Connie's relationship whatsoever when it comes to their development. I still found the shipping really good, in all honesty, but when it comes to this direction that they took, they could have done it a lot more better instead of just making it shallow. Which is why I'm giving Kevin Party a 4 out of 10. This is gonna be mostly weird knowing that the following episodes, people say that Connie doesn't contribute much, but in all honesty, despite the aftermath of Kevin Party, I don't even think that Connie wasn't really misused whatsoever. Say all you want, but I've actually looked into it in order to see probably one of the positives involving the later episodes is involving Connie. Jungle Moon is the episode where Stefani goes onto a planet to do a mission while also gaining information involving Pink Diamond herself. Considering that this is the episode right after Kevin Party and Laws of the Stars, I got a feeling that they were planning on doing an episode centering around Connie gaining the understanding of what a space mission is like, but at the same time, I can't really think of the positives aside from the environments of the planet itself. Admittedly, the idea of Stefani going on a space mission while also learning some information about Pink Diamond along with Connie giving an understanding of what a space mission is like is somewhat potential. It's just that what happened after Kevin's party, with everything just resolved so simply, it really makes this really difficult to take itself a little bit more seriously. I would either be fine if Steven was with the other characters, mainly Garnet, Amethyst, or Pearl, to go on this mission, but on the other hand, I really feel like that the idea of Stefani with a fusion of Steven and Connie working together doesn't really fit the more I think about it. Yes, Connie wasn't misused towards the end when it comes to the aftermath of Kevin Party, but the thing is, her being in this episode being the fusion with Steven and giving an understanding of what Little Diamond is, even though that Steven has an understanding of Little Diamond really is, it would have been much more appropriate if Connie was with Steven and Laws the entire time in the finale of Season 4 and the beginning of Season 5. I wanted to believe that this episode is trying to be grand, knowing that Steven and Connie are on a planet to do the very first mission solo without Paul, but the more I think about it, it doesn't really feel that exciting after watching all the episodes. Regardless if I actually found the Pink Diamond reveal in a single pair of walls mostly tolerable for my taste, I still feel like that this is mostly misuse of the fact that Connie just should have given an understanding of what the diamonds who are mostly a bigger threat compared to the other corrupted gems, and knowing full well that this isn't going to be much more simpler. I think that the reason onto why Stefani didn't have any issues in this episode, aside from the dream sequence, is because the planet itself, no matter the environments being amazing, it's way too simple, because we don't get to see a lot of creatures compared to the other corrupted gems from the other episodes. It's really difficult to think that out of everything that Steven has went through, especially Conley with her experiences, this just leads to a single episode involving Stefani just going on a jungle planet, and then at the same time, that's basically it. We don't get multiple episodes aside from the fact that in the previous episode, we get the introduction of Laws being a space pilot. Look, I'm fully aware that the dream sequence is a major factor in this episode, settling around Pink Diamond and Little Diamond. Unfortunately, knowing of how much that this is a representation of Stefani acting like Pink Diamond, and the fact that we get less information about Pink Diamond, and the fact that Steven needs to do everything in order to reverse all the damages that she caused, I still don't think that Connie is mostly concerned about Pink Diamond in general. And knowing the fact that this is mostly a missed opportunity to have Connie have some kind of a redemption arc after how she was betrayed in the breakup arc, then her argument about being in a fusion with Steven in order to take down the diamonds and all that stuff feels a lot more difficult to believe, knowing that this episode alone barely shows any of it. Seriously. Regardless if the dream sequence has Connie's mother in it, doesn't really change much, because at the same time, I just think that it just doesn't really fit whatsoever. I guess it kind of sums up onto why Connie was mostly misused, but on the other hand, I still feel like that she is somewhat important when she was with Steven on Homeworld, and we're gonna get to that soon. Bottom line, the what-ifs are really annoying, in the fact that the idea of making these episodes an extension into multiple episodes is a lot more questionable when you completely look at the runtime of each episode. But at the same time, knowing of how this is the first episode where Steven and Connie are working together after the breakup, I'm sorry, I just found that difficult to believe. Especially that I do not see Stefani as a different person in this episode compared to the other appearances involving Stefani. Which is why I'm giving this episode a 5.5 out of 10. Sorry, but even if I reviewed this episode in its own video instead of including this into the Connverse Anthology, nothing would have changed, honestly. That's how much that most of the episodes of this show, regardless if they're good, didn't really got me thrilled the more I think about it. Okay, I need to make one thing clear in case if anyone does a counter argument. I am fully aware that the diamonds are genocidals. It's no surprise at this point that the many times I see people completely criticizing the show, it's towards the diamonds and the fact that they're genocidals. For one thing, I'm gonna talk about most of the details once I get to them in a separate video. Since I've already talked about Pink Diamond in a single pair of walls almost a year ago, it will be fitting for me to talk about the diamond side of the story, other than the fact that the potential before anyone watches the later episodes if they'll start binge watching this series for the first time. I really feel like the world building in this show isn't supposed to be like Adventure Time or any of the other cartoons that I've witnessed and got the information from. I think that pretty much sums up onto how Rebecca Sugar is mostly optimistic when she completely made this entire show from beginning to end. Together Alone is going to be a little bit more confusing knowing that Connie actually does something towards the end, while the majority of it, she's just mostly set on the sidelines, while also being referred to Steven's bet by the Diamonds. I need to be clear with you. When I first watched this episode during my binge watch, I wasn't expecting much, knowing that the characters in this are supposed to understand what diamond culture is like on Homeworld. And to be quite honest, that's probably the biggest highlight in this episode. Since that Leto and Blue Diamond have been taken over Homeworld and just trying to make things better for themselves, I really think that what Steven and Connie did in this episode is mostly justified, knowing that no one will probably be able to understand what actual fun is when all they did is just taking orders from Yellow and Blue Diamond. Since I'm one of the only people who actually found this show somewhat underway even after the changes that they did, to be honest with you, even if I had the chance to rewatch this entire show while doing a reaction of each episode, my reactions will probably still be the same, knowing that this show is supposed to be its own thing, even though that the issues of the show itself is what causes people to have second thoughts after watching the later seasons. Around the time this episode aired, just before the finale premiered in the following year, Steven Universe became 4 years old around that time. And for me personally, since I'm one of the people who watched this show after Future came to an end, the binge watching wasn't really much of an issue, since it only took me 2 months to watch every single episode. Granted, I had to rewatch an episode before I had to make my review on it, but the more I think about it, this show really feels a lot more harmless, regardless if you look past most of the elements that what makes this show entirely important. Look, I'm not expecting everyone to turn off the brain whether they think of the moments involving Steven's trauma, the diamonds, or any of that kind of stuff. What I mean is that if you're an average fan who just got into the series despite it ending and watched all the episodes until you watch the whole series and you actually find some different opinions of what people think about this show, it kind of sums up onto why Steven Universe is still a good cartoon, but on the other hand, I don't think it really fell from grace. I mean, it kind of did, but at the same time, it's not really in a mediocre sense of how most of the elements of this show has completely dropped due to most of the decisions that Rebecca Sugar did during production. Here's one of the reasons why I'm including this episode in this Anthology series. Connie is just trying to do something nice with Steven by having a dance. Granted, not the way that the Diamonds want them to do, and even if people may say that Connie did this in order to make things worse for the Crystal Gems and Steven, but the thing is, it's been a while since Steven and Connie did something fun together. Knowing that after Kevin Party, they didn't do much when it comes to activities, and just by seeing them actually dancing together and actually seeing them fuse into Stefani, there's really not a lot of moments settling around Steven and Connie towards the end of the series. Since they first met in Bubble Buddies, along with their development growing afterwards, I really feel like that everything that we've seen in this episode involving Steven and Connie turning into Stefani, I'm pretty sure that this is supposed to be the end of the arc in the original series. Granted, the breakup arc is the biggest problem I have with this relationship, but it really feels like that's probably one of the final elements that the production wanted to do involving the relationship. Well, towards the beginning of the show, they've grown so much, and then they need to figure out a way to make it interesting, but at the same time, they just couldn't be able to get the right to get the notes right, knowing of how it just messes up Connie's character more than just giving Steven more depth. Like, he needs to learn from his mistakes, even though that his decisions were entirely understandable. To be honest, if you watch an episode from the show for a few times after watching it the first time, you won't have the same emotional experience. And to be honest, for how long I've watched and heard of this show from time to time before I got into it back in 2020, it makes me think that most of the moments between the characters, along with most of the other elements, are mostly harmless as time goes by. Granted, some people may see they have gotten worse by time, but on the other hand, Steven Universe is becoming one of those shows that is just difficult to enjoy if the fan base just completely interferes it. In all honesty, this episode is part of a mini-series similar to Adventure Time's Stakes, Islands, and Elements. Mainly the fact that these episodes are leading up to the finale. Granted, I can understand that people may correct me on the fact that this episode is settling around the diamonds and nothing more, but considering that I have mixed opinions towards these types of characters, it'll be for a later time where I think about the diamonds' personalities and traits instead of just being on board on which the diamonds are good or bad, as in likable characters but sometimes problematic characters. So I'm giving this episode a 6.75 out of 10, and with that, we are officially done with the original series and we're going straight into the epilogue known as Steven Universe Future. Bismuth Casual is mostly a Paul and Bismuth Center episode than anything, but on the other hand, I'm pretty sure that they won't be able to carry the entire episode by themselves. Regardless if this episode still has the Steven-only perspective, I still feel like this is one of the less problematic episodes to have that problem. Mostly the fact that this is also centering around Steven's relationship with the other characters, knowing that they're going to be moving forward with their lives while he's going to end up alone, but that's what he thinks. Granted, this episode in Future is a filler episode compared to the other episodes in this epilogue series, but the thing is, I consider this the best filler episode compared to the other filler episodes, but that's mostly up for debate. Knowing that Pearl has more adjustment with human culture and she's trying to give Bismuth some human culture outside of their environment, the Steven-only perspective in this doesn't really bother me that much, considering that his purpose in this does feel a lot more important, knowing that his trauma doesn't get in the way in this episode. He doesn't get pink outbursts whatsoever, and considering that in the following episode we're going to be talking about where he does have an outburst, kind of, I feel like that this episode is mostly a slowing process of the following episode. Since Connie's life has been improving over the last 2 years since that the restrictions have been lifted off from her life, she was able to make some friends along the way, which mostly concerns Steven. Granted, considering that Steven never went to school in his life, I really feel like that having an episode settling around Steven going to school could have been an interesting idea, but on the other hand, they really wanted to treat Steven the different lifestyle compared to what we live in the real world. Which really makes this episode a lot more interesting knowing that Steven is actually important. If it wasn't for Steven being part of this episode, getting some experience involving Connie moving on to go to college, along with Paul and Bismuth trying to have a great time together after saving the galaxy or universe twice, if you want to count Spinell from the movie, I really feel like that this episode, from Steven's perspective, is mostly about how he needs to move forward in life, even though that in some points he doesn't have to. I need to make one thing clear, because this is probably going to be the final time I'm going to talk about Bismuth, even though I discussed most about her in my Bismuth review last year. Knowing that her development is mostly shallow and less compared to the other crystal gems, I really feel like that her purpose in future is mostly being like Steven, knowing that she won't be able to think about her future when it comes to her decisions, which is similar to Steven. Granted, in this case, she's just trying to hang out with Paul, which is mostly her way of just trying to move forward in the future. But knowing that Steven is dealing with the same things with Connie in this, it really feels like that Bismuth and Steven are basically on the same page. Granted, the only time where Bismuth actually returns after her debut was mostly before Ruby and Sapphire's wedding, and considering that that's where she's trying to give an understanding of what is actually going on at the moment when it comes to the whole Rose was pink diamond all along, I'm pretty sure that if she didn't return in about 2 seasons later, and she actually returned way earlier than that, I'm going to assume that her presence will probably be mostly an antagonist towards Steven, which is mostly what I think of when it comes to Bismuth. Bismuth is his character. I need to be honest with you guys. This episode alone, regardless if you look at Steven and Connie or just Bismuth and Paula separately, there's no difference whatsoever, since that Steven is just trying to think of the positives of his life by moving forward, while dealing with the fact that Connie is going to be moving to a different college. Well, some of that might change in the next episode I'm going to be talking about, but the bottom line is, I really feel like that having an episode settling around Bismuth and Paula won't be able to work out without Steven and Connie. I'm just saying. I mean, if you guys can accept the idea of not a lot of Stevens in all the episodes, then I'm pretty sure that you're pushing the whole Steven perspective thing a little bit too much. Like I said, I can understand where people are coming from, but there's only a once in a while bit time, well, a main character should not appear, like not becoming a major protagonist whatsoever. And no, it's not because this is the final episode while Stefani appears, it's just that I really feel like for how it's portrayed on just trying to see the brighter things of what Bismuth and Paul are going to be doing together, I really feel like that Bismuth's future, along with Paul, will just be like Steven and Connie, but not in a romantic relationship. I mean, I understand that people ship these two to the point that they want to have a wedding with each other, mainly Paul and Bismuth, but if the more I think about it, this show only needs one gay wedding, and I'm pretty sure that for any fanfic writer or artists will probably do their own fan service in order to make those kind of stuff a reality. Because for my opinion on this, I doubt one episode will be enough. Knowing that Paul is slowly moving forward after the Rose was pink diamond all along with Bismuth trying to focus on a better life for herself, I really feel like that this LGBT relationship between Bismuth and Paul needs more episodes, knowing that Ruby and Sapphire had the most attention evolving that category. Yes, I know I keep going on and on about LGBT since that people are finding that as a major factor from this show, but I'm still new to it and I'm trying to get a knowledge of it if I'm ever going to do a month dedicated to it once we get into Pride Month this year. So, when it comes to Steven and Connie forming into Savani and gaining the admiration from everyone in the building, they picked the song that Paul enjoyed from listening to it inside the car along the way to their destination. If you ask me, it's basically what Steven would do in any other scenario, whether he sees a similar scenario involving friendship. Let me just say this right now, the fact that I completely understand Paul and Bismuth's relationship a lot more just by watching this episode. Sums up of what this entire mean of LGBT is in this show. But then again, Rebecca Sugar was really into that kind of stuff while writing episodes from the show and the original. To be real with you, with this episode being less about Connie's character, I still feel like that even without her, Steven won't be able to help out with the other crystal gems. And considering that I actually found this filler episode from Future somewhat entertaining, I can instantly tell that we will probably not have a Paul and Bismuth episode whatsoever. So I think that this is mostly for the Paul and Bismuth shippers than anything. So I'm giving this episode a 6.5 out of 10. I need to make one thing perfectly clear before we get into Together Forever. I am aware that the combination of Steven and Connie's fusion into Stefani is somewhat transgender, as in basically the other element in the LGBT community. I understand that it can be a bit confusing knowing that people find that as an element in that community, but for me personally, I'm not really into that kind of stuff, and I've learned about this just about a week ago when I'm doing my research involving LGBT relationships during a community that people have so much interest in. Not really everyone, but mostly the ones who really enjoy this type of community. But at the same time, Stefani could be intersex for all I know, mostly at the fact that intersex and transgender are mostly different from each other. The reason why I brought this up is because I am actually thankful that Steven and Connie didn't make the choice to fuse together, because judging of how Connie is 14 and Steven is 16, Steven obviously watched this out. I know people say that he didn't think this through, but he instantly had to watch in order to get what he wants. Like I've mentioned before, Connie's gonna be moving to a college that is farther away from Beach City, which concerns Steven to the point that he's gonna be more alone than he thinks. Usually, people would feel what Steven is going through, but when it comes to a romantic relationship, yeah, I honestly think that if I was Steven in this situation, I would still have second thoughts, but at the same time, I had to do what I could in order to make things right for not only for myself, but for the girl I'm with. Since this is the first episode, I'm talking about Ruby and Sapphire. Yeah, I'm way ahead of my Steven Universe month, but to be quite honest, this is the closest way I can talk about these characters whenever I'm talking about Steven and Connie. At least give me credit that I'm trying to focus on everything. So, the purpose in this episode is to give Steven some advice on trying to propose to Connie, while also thinking about the positives of what Steven can do with Connie in his future. But keep this in mind, this also leads to them being separated to not being fused into Garnet. Knowing that Garnet actually sees the future more than Sapphire, which, in all honesty, it could be a fact that Garnet is much more superior towards Sapphire by looking into the future than her. Which really sums up onto why Garnet wasn't present in the majority of this episode, only from the beginning and towards the end, at the end of this. I really feel like that they really need to have Ruby and Sapphire being a factor in this by being somewhat of Steven's supporters because they looked up to Steven the most. But at the same time, Garnet is 100% honest. When it comes to Sapphire, she can be honest, but at the same time, it's also difficult to think that she can predict everything 100% like Garnet. But then again, I'm pretty sure that people who are not in a fusion can't be able to do a lot of things. I mean, they can do things on their own, but knowing that we see history involving Ruby and Sapphire, that sums up everything. But to give this episode credit, this is the first time since Kevin Party, well, Connie actually gets some development. I understand that in the previous episodes, she doesn't get much development, and most of the other episodes are focusing on other elements, which sums up onto why I should have looked into those elements a lot more. But the thing is, the purpose involving Connie's character towards the end of the series is mostly of how she is still somewhat of a relatable character even after everything that happened, including after Kevin party. I want to make one thing clear when it comes to the episode's pacing. Regardless if it's still on point, I feel like that if Connie was with Steven the entire episode, I'm pretty sure that this episode will probably stale and not giving Steven much development on what he needs to think or reconsider about his choice on doing the proposal to Connie or not. But unfortunately, he has to think about what Ruby and Sapphire went through, knowing that it was literally the only pairing that he thought of when it comes to doing the wedding, that he was 14 around the time, and then when he gets older, he thinks the same thing can happen to him, because we all know that the crystal gems don't really have an age whatsoever. The people who do not like this show that much can instantly critique on the idea of Steven proposing to Connie while she is underage. May I remind you that if you're ever in Steven's position, you would not think of what other critics would think about the mistake that you cause. It's honestly a lot more understandable when you could really see that Steven, regardless if he's a hero in so many of the Gem's eyes, including Beach City, can't be able to handle normal social life in the human world. And believe me, regardless if you do not like the PTSD development that he received in this season, it's literally the only element that he probably has left, because I'm pretty sure that without it, his future with the other characters will probably be like ours. And it won't be any extraordinary. It will just be mostly what you expect when it comes to the other person agreeing with your points. And it's the fact that one of our lives are private. I'm not defending the fact that Rebecca Sugar did not write an episode involving Steven having a therapist, because she mentioned that it's supposed to be Steven's privacy, but when it comes to moments like these, while Steven is outside of everyone else's lives, while he's trying to think about his future, you will probably express what your experiences were so that he can get inspiration. Because as far as I'm concerned, the only inspiration that he had is the true love involving Ruby and Sapphire. And that's not as similar compared to real-life romantic relationships. Let me discuss the song I'd Rather Be Me With You, sung by Steven, which is a good song. It really sums up on the fact that besides the crystal gems, Connie is literally the only person that Steven really cares about. And I'm pretty sure that if we didn't had this song in this episode, and the fact that we don't be able to see Connie that much in this season aside from a few appearances, I really feel like that Steven won't be able to have the chance to move forward if Connie didn't move to college right away. I truly believe that with this episode being 2 years old, along with the finale of Future being almost 2 years old, I can instantly tell that this show is somewhat aged. I know some haters are not going to agree with me since that there are so many elements that I'm missing out on, but I don't look at everything. Granted, I try to pick the elements that I admire the most and try to critique the most, but when it comes to the elements in this episode alone with Future, believe me when I say this, is that there's a possibility that Steven Universe Month could be way more if I extended it. Let's get into the infamous proposal, and I put quotation marks in proposal because people see this as the unpredictability of Steven's stupidity. I understand that Steven was way ahead on thinking about this, about thinking about his choice to propose to Connie, but I'm pretty sure that this didn't lead to anything physical because he really feels that what Connie said to him wasn't really enough. Because even if she did say that he means more to her than anything, he also thinks otherwise, knowing that he didn't express his trauma or anything to anyone, including her. Knowing that people have complaints involving Steven not having the chance to express his trauma only until the final episodes of the show where he somewhat did, I can instantly tell that not everyone can be 100% stable. Because as far as I'm concerned, this is basically a demonstration of what the longer generation would admire Steven if they ever go into the same scenarios of what he went through, minus saving the galaxy and stuff. My point is that every time I think about Steven's trauma in this, it's mostly about how he's just trying to make the right choices. And when it comes to Connie, her shining moment towards the end, well, she makes a speech about how Steven is thinking about everyone but himself, and he puts everyone else's feelings first. Connie will probably do the same thing in this scenario if she actually expressed it now instead of later on. But that will probably make I Am My Monster a really good episode for fans who still admire the series. There was probably a lot I would discuss about this episode, but aside from the ending involving Steven and Garnet, along with Connie mentioning to Steven that it's a not now when it comes to Steven's proposal, I can instantly tell that this episode is basically what it is. It's mostly an episode that the shippers have been waiting such a long time since the very beginning of this show. I can instantly see this episode mostly a final chapter, while the following episode I'm going to be discussing as the epilogue. Because for me personally, if it wasn't for this episode alone, the following episode would feel a lot more off, knowing that it's going to be difficult to see Connie helping out Steven after the failed proposal. Well, without the failed proposal is what I mean. And knowing that this episode does mean something involving Steven's life and just trying to move forward with his life, it's going to be a lot more interesting to see of how people will relook these episodes as the years gone by. So I give this episode an 8 out of 10, and when it comes to I Rather'd Be Me With You, it's a really great song. Granted, I would prefer other songs, but I still think that this is still a wholesome song nonetheless. You know, when some of you guys are thinking that one of these videos, mainly the Anthology series, is what's causing my motivations on making videos becoming slower and slower because I don't have the same ability like I have last year, I wanted to focus on cartoons that I haven't watched before and give my own perspective on them, knowing that some reactors who reacted episodes from this show have gotten much attention, even though they're much more better than me. I'm just saying this right now, episodes involving growing pains and some of the events afterwards are somewhat important into why I'm reviewing 8 episodes in one video. To cut things short on the plot of this episode, Connie sends Steven to the hospital with her mother so that she can check on him, mostly the fact that Steven is part gem and part human. I have to say this right now, I really feel like that if it wasn't without Connie's mother in this, I'm pretty sure that this episode wouldn't be a really interesting episode at that compared to the previous episode. In the beginning of this episode, Steven is watching Dark Copter 6, And in all honesty, the fact that this centers around romance towards the end, I really feel like that's what he's really feeling involving his breakup with Connie. And considering that people see this episode about Steven's trauma, which also leads to the following episode where he and his father go on a road trip to see his parents, well, not really his parents, but mostly his parents' house. That's an episode that I'm going to be looking forward to talk about in the future. But when it comes to Steven's motivations in this, he wouldn't expect anything when it comes to Connie's mother checking him out. For me personally, knowing that Steven has never been to a doctor before, and the fact that Connie's mother is actually his very first doctor, I really feel like that what anyone would expect involving Steven's perspective in this is mostly of how he is dealing with everything that is always new to him. Like, the fact that he's 16 in this, and the fact that he is witnessing a doctor for the very first time. I'm pretty sure that the therapist episode that people were expecting from this will be the same thing as this episode. I understand that it's difficult to think about that, knowing that therapists can actually give more help to the victim than the doctor, but I can instantly tell that for how that this episode is portraying Connie's mother just trying to help out Steven in order to help with his problems, I can instantly see this mostly as a therapist episode, even though it wasn't meant to be a therapist episode. Granted, Connie's mother is checking Steven's body parts, which is honestly a lot more astounding when you could really see Amethyst, Paul, and Garnet having no bones in their bodies. And then when you could really see of how that Steven isn't like a complete crystal gem, I really feel like that for what anyone else would expect will probably be Steven having no bones whatsoever. I'm just saying. If I did watch this show and understand every single detail of it when it was airing new episodes, I would assume that Steven would have no bones whatsoever. Well, aside from eating and obviously doing the other stuff of what humans usually do. But my weakest theory, and I did say weakest, is the fact that Steven has no bones, similar to his guardians. The reason why I came up with this theory is because I instantly think of what Steven is portrayed in the earlier seasons is somewhat of him being like the other Crystal Gems, but that's what the Crystal Gems think, since that they don't even take care of him that much when it comes to them just trying to stop corrupted gems from wreaking havoc. And every time I instantly think about the moments where Steven actually eats, it's probably the only thing that he can do, which is somewhat similar to Amethyst, except that Amethyst just completely takes the food out of her body. And I do not say that to be disgusting. I'm just saying that she probably shove her mouth inside of her body and just takes the food out of him because she really enjoys it and he wants to keep eating. I'm just saying. I just don't understand how Amethyst can live in a world where she eats regardless. But on the other hand, if she really needs to eat, she will probably just take the food out of her instead of just doing what we all do in the bathroom. Now, to cut things short involving Connie's presence in this episode, regardless if this is somewhat of an epilogue of her development, I'm just gonna say this right now. I feel like that they were planning on having Connie telling her mother the truth about the proposal that Steven did, but unfortunately, I don't think that Connie's mother will instantly improve on it. I know that she has gained development since her very first appearance, but knowing that she isn't really on board with Connie being with Steven 100%, even though that she sent Connie to space, I'm honestly going to assume that for what she is going to experience in the next moment involving seeing Steven and Connie getting married, it will probably be the last thing that she has on her mind. Knowing that she does a lot more research involving the crystal gems and Steven, since that this is literally of how she's experiencing a lot of stuff, and the fact that it's somewhat normal to her, I don't even think that she would still be in the idea of having her daughter being in a wife and husband relationship with Steven. I highly doubt that it will probably work out. And considering that this never actually happened involving the wedding between Steven and Connie whatsoever, similar to Sapphire and Ruby from the previous season, I really feel like that if we did have a second season, the wedding between Steven and Connie will happen way later, or probably in another season, which is obviously a zero possibility. To be honest, aside from Steven dealing with a midlife crisis at the moment, there's really nothing else I can say about this episode when it comes to how it's the aftermath of Together Forever. With this episode focusing on the following episode with Greg taking Steven with him, I really feel like that this episode, regardless if it's not a therapist episode, did what it could in order to give an epilogue involving Steven and Connie, since that Steven is really depressed that he can't be able to be with Connie, but at the same time, he doesn't want to disappoint Connie whatsoever. When it comes to how it's structured, I really feel like that if Connie played a bigger role in this, will probably make the episode a little bit more too predictable, not to mention the fact that what Connie's mother is doing with Steven will probably be the same thing regardless. And I'm pretty sure that at this point, this episode alone, even if you really think about Steven's trauma, then his relationship with Connie, I can tell for a fact that this would not even happen if the proposal never happened in the previous episode. So I'm giving this episode a 7 out of 10. When it comes to the final episodes of the show involving Connie giving a speech involving Steven thinking about others but not himself, I have to admit right now, this is the moment that if it didn't happen in the final episodes of the show, then I'm pretty sure that Connie will have been wasted. Believe me when I say this, even though there were so many moments that she could have had a chance to shine even more brighter, I think at this point, she really doesn't need to shine anymore aside from the speech that she's giving towards the other characters. Because as you can tell, she isn't like Steven whatsoever, and the quote that she says involving, "I may not have your powers, but she gave him a kiss regardless," while Steven was transformed into a monster. If that is the moment that doesn't show how much that she cares about Steven, then I don't know what it is. It just really proves to me that they really think about having a closure involving Steven and Connie towards the end of the series, but unfortunately, they couldn't pick the best one due to so many changes during the storyboard production. I have to admit right now, regardless if storyboard artists were mostly responsible with this, it really feels like they had the best of their ability to make this a really important scene involving Connie, even though that they could have done it a lot more better if they had a planned way ahead of time. They did have a plan involving the pink diamond revealed, but if you ask me, I really feel like that they did what they could in order to make this a lot more interesting than it already is. So, for me personally, I really feel like the I Am My Monster involving Connie just trying to save Steven by kissing him in order to have him break the trauma from him is probably a great way to wrap up this somewhat relationship. And then in the following episode where they kiss, I have to admit that's actually somewhat of a great closure to the relationship. Granted, there could have been a lot more, but knowing that they do have plans on becoming wife and husband in the future when they're really ready, then I really feel like that's probably one of the examples where their relationship can be private. Like I said, I admit that the whole Steven not having a therapist on screen is somewhat problematic, but if you ask me, that's probably one of the only elements that does need to be shown on screen. when it comes to elements like this, I really do not think that it really needs to be on screen, because as far as I'm concerned, it's just panning out to the point that it will make future way more longer, similar to the same length of episodes as the first season of the original. And with that, this Anthology series is officially over, and to be quite honest, I still enjoy this shipping regardless of what people would think of it otherwise. Because as far as I'm concerned, without it, I'm pretty sure that I won't be able to enjoy Steven Universe when it comes to the other elements. Nowadays, I do get into those elements by thinking about it and getting into newer elements in other communities, but believe me when I say this, this was a difficult project that I'm mostly regretful for since doing the first part of it in last year's February schedule. But in all honesty, it's mostly worth it, and the good part is, I do not have to talk about anything involving this relationship ever again. Because everything I said in those Anthology parts were probably everything of what I expressed, and nothing has changed regardless. Granted, nowadays, I have most regrets on doing this because I had to wrap everything up, but this was a first to me. Aside from the Shadow Showdown trilogy videos involving Darkseid Omi and Evil Raimundo episodes, I really feel like that this was instantly a difficult task since that it was going to take me multiple parts, but at least I managed to do all of them in 1 year. That's mostly a positive, which is something I don't usually do when it comes to other projects, aside from fanfic readings. So, all I can say is that if you still enjoy this shipping, that's good for you. If you gave up on it when it comes to the breakup arc, or somewhere before that, then I can understand what you mean. Because as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to Steven Universe month happening in the future, I do not have any plans involving reviewing anything from this show anytime soon, because aside from the Beach City episodes, I really need to keep my perspective from the show away so that I can put my own perspective on other shows in the meantime. Granted, my schedule isn't going to change in the future, but hopefully, with this being out of the way, I do not have to be concerned into reviewing multiple episodes in one video for such a long time. Well, that could instantly change in the future, but who knows? So, I'm Lonely Fanboy 4 here, and I hope you guys enjoy your Valentine's Day.